The high desert sky over the Flintwater Basin groaned, a low rumble of distant thunder that promised violence but offered no relief. It was a hard land, this basin, a place that baked optimism to dust and left only the grit. The rain, when it finally came, wasn't a blessing. It was a cold, thin misery that turned the alkali flats into a clinging, gray paste. It was this paste that finally doomed the horse. She was a good bay mare, run ragged for maybe 50 miles, and her lungs were burning. She made a sound, half sob, half scream, as her forelegs snapped in a washout hidden by the dark. The woman riding her didn't fall. She slid from the saddle as the animal collapsed, her own legs barely able to hold her. Her name was Arden Vale. The dust of 3 territories was caked onto her wool coat, a coat stained dark under the left arm, not just by rain, but by something thicker. The sharp tang of black powder clung to her, a bitter perfume. She staggered toward the only light in the black expanse, a single, yellow square burning in the window of a ranch house. It sat alone on the slope of Cinder Ridge, a place locals knew to leave be. Arden reached the porch, her hand, raw and scraped, grabbed the railing. She tried to haul herself up the 3 steps, but her legs gave out. She pitched forward, her head striking the rough-hewn boards with the dull, final sound of a sack of grain hitting a floor. Then the world, which had been gray and spinning, went black. Inside, Coulter Rook didn't jump. He'd been sitting at his kitchen table, oiling the action of his Spencer repeating rifle by the light of that same lamp. He was a widower, and the silence of the Cinder Ridge Ranch was his only companion. He knew the sounds of his land. He knew the wind, the coyote, the shifting of his cattle. This sound was wrong. He didn't call out. He didn't light another lamp. He simply stood, the Spencer fitting into his shoulder as if it were part of his own arm. The hammer clicked back under his thumb, a small, deadly noise. He moved to the door and eased it open a bare 2 inches. The wind tried to shove it, bringing the smell of wet pine and iron. He saw the shape crumpled on his porch. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't one of his hands. It was small, indistinct, and dangerously still. He stepped out, the rifle leveled. "Stay put," he commanded, his voice rough from a day of disuse. The shape did not move. He nudged it with his boot, a soft groan, feminine. Coulter's jaw tightened. A woman, out here, in this storm. He lowered the rifle, resting its stock on the porch, but kept it within a foot of his right hand. He knelt. The smell of gunpowder was stronger now, mixed with wet wool and something else, blood. He slid his fingers under the angle of her jaw. Her skin was cold as the rain, but the pulse was there, a frantic, shallow tapping, like a bird trapped in a box. She was alive, barely. He ran his hands over her quickly, checking for weapons. A knife was sheathed at her hip, but her hands were limp. He was looking for the wound. He found it on her left side, a sodden mass. He pulled back the heavy coat. This close, he could smell it clearly. It wasn't the sharp sulfur of a gunshot. It was just the flat, coppery smell of blood. Her shirt, once linen, was glued to her skin. He tore it gently. He'd seen bullet wounds, dozens. This was not a bullet wound. This was a long, wicked gash, running 4 inches along her ribs. It was deep, but it was a slice. He probed the edge carefully, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle. He felt something, a sliver, thin and sharp, embedded in the flesh. He pulled it free, even in the dim light from the doorway. It caught the lamp glow. Glass, thick, curved glass from a wagon lantern or a coach window. She hadn't been in a gunfight. She'd been in a wreck. She'd been running. Arden's eyes fluttered open. They were dark, wild with panic, seeing nothing but a large, bearded shape looming over her in the dark. A low keen started in her throat. Her breathing hitched, turning into a series of short, painful gasps. "Easy," Coulter said. The word was a rumble. He saw the panic rising. the kind that could kill a person faster than blood loss. He needed to anchor her. He stepped back inside, grabbed a rag from the wash basin, and dipped it in the lukewarm water. He returned and knelt beside her again. He wiped the gray mud from her face, his touch methodical. Her features emerged. She was young, maybe 23, 24, too young for the exhaustion etched around her eyes. "You're safe now," he said, his voice flat, stating a fact. "You're on my porch. No one's coming." She tried to focus on him. Her chest hitched again. "You're breathing too fast. You'll faint." He tossed the rag aside and laid his broad, warm palm flat against her upper chest, just below the collarbone. Her skin was freezing. "Breathe against my hand," he ordered. "Slow." She flinched at the contact, but she was too weak to pull away. "Match me," he said. He took a deep, slow breath, his hand rising with his own chest. In and out. He felt the frantic tempo of her breathing stutter under his hand. She tried, a shuddering gasp. Again, slow, in and out. Her breathing hitched, caught his rhythm for one beat, then two. The panic in her eyes didn't fade, but the sharp terror softened into a dull, exhausted fear. Her body relaxed, slumping more heavily onto the boards. It was in that moment of fragile silence, just as her breathing steadied, that the new sound came. Clang, clang, clang. Coulter froze. His hand was still on her chest, and he felt her heart leap under his palm. It was distant, carried on the wind from the east, the alarm bell from the dry-line patrol station. It wasn't the steady ring of a time check. It was the search bell. 3 sharp tolls, a pause, then 3 more. They were hunting someone. He looked down at the woman. He looked east, toward the sound of the bell. Rumors had been thick in Rattler for a week. The Seven Spires Railroad Company was moving in. And they weren't asking politely. They were buying up water rights and fencing off the range. Tonight, according in the talk at the saloon, someone had hit the railroad's main salt depot, stolen a wagon load of curing salt, and worse, injured a company guard. Now, a posse was sweeping the basin, and a wounded woman had just fallen on his doorstep. He cursed, low and soft. He couldn't leave her on the porch, but bringing her inside, that was an invitation to trouble he hadn't sent. "Can you stand?" he asked. Arden just looked at him, her eyes barely tracking. He made the decision. He hooked one arm under her knees and the other behind her back, lifting her. She was light, all bone and wet wool. He didn't take her into the house. Not yet. The blood trail would be too obvious. He carried her across the muddy yard, his boots sinking deep, mixing his tracks with the rain. He went to the old sheep pen, a low structure he hadn't used in 2 years, not since the flock blight. It smelled of dry rot, old lanolin, and dust. He laid her gently on a pile of old, dry sacking in the darkest corner. "I have to see to the house," he whispered, his voice close to her ear. She shivered, whether from cold or fear. He couldn't tell. "You don't make a sound. Not a cough, not a breath. You understand me. They find you here. I can't help you." He pulled a heavy canvas tarp, stiff with straw and old pitch, over the entrance to the pen. From the outside, it just looked like a pile of refuse somebody had forgotten to burn. "I'll be back," he said through the canvas. "I'll be back to stitch that wound when the moon drops." He walked back to the house, his strides calm and even. He left the bloodstain on the porch. The rain was already working on it, turning the dark red to a thin, watery pink. He went inside, barred the door, and walked to the hearth. He stirred the coals, adding 2 fresh logs. Then he went back to the kitchen table, picked up his coffee mug, and poured it full from the pot that had been simmering for 6 hours. He returned to the front porch, sat in his high-backed rocker, and placed the Spencer rifle across his lap. He sipped his coffee, a solitary rancher, watching the storm. He waited. It took 10 minutes. They came from the east, following the line of ghost elm trees that marked his property line. 5 riders, dark shapes in dark slickers. Their lantern, held high, cast wild, dancing shadows. "Rook!" a voice called out. It was not a voice he knew. That was bad. "Evening," Coulter called back. His voice was calm. He didn't stand. He just rocked, the mug in his hand. The lead rider, a heavy man with a territorial marshal's badge gleaming wetly on his chest, stopped his horse 10 feet from the porch. His eyes swept the yard. Coulter knew what he was looking for. Tracks, a spent horse, blood. The rain was his ally. "Quiet night," Coulter said, sipping his coffee. "Not so quiet, friend," the marshal said. His lantern beam cut across the yard, illuminating the rain as a silver sheet. "We're a posse out of dry line, looking for the party that hit the Seven Spires depot tonight." "Heard the talk," Coulter said. "Salt." "More than salt," another rider spat. "They assaulted a guard, left him for dead. We're looking for a woman, small, dark hair, riding a bay." Coulter's heart turned to a cold stone. He didn't flinch. He let his eyes follow the lantern beam. It swept over the barn, the water trough. It landed on the sheep pen, lingering on the pile of refuse tarp. Coulter's hand tightened on the Spencer. "You seen anyone?" Rook rider moving fast bay horse. Coulter took another slow sip. "Just the rain, Marshal, and the wind, blowing hard from the south. Anything that came through here an hour ago, tracks already gone." The marshal stared at him, the lantern light catching the suspicion in his eyes. Coulter Rook was known. He kept to himself. He wasn't a friend to the railroad, but he wasn't an enemy. He was just there, a rock. The impasse held for a long count. "Finally," the marshal grunted. "Keep that Spencer loaded. She's armed and she's desperate, and she's bleeding. Won't get far." "I always do," Coulter said. The posse moved on, their lantern light swallowed by the rain, the sound of the bell fading back into the thunder. Coulter waited until he couldn't hear the horses. He waited another 5 minutes after that. Then he stood, dumped his coffee on the ground, and went to the sheep pen. She was unconscious when he pulled the tarp back, her breathing shallow. He lifted her again. This time, he carried her into the house, straight to the kitchen. He laid her on the thick bearskin rug in front of the hearth, where the fire was finally catching. The warmth began to steam the damp from her clothes. He barred the door. He lit 2 more lamps, flooding the small cabin with yellow light. He needed to see the wound. He took the knife from her belt and used it to slit the wet, torn linen shirt, cutting it away from the gash. It was bad. It was bleeding sluggishly, but it was deep. It would need stitching. As he worked, the firelight danced on her face and on something else. Tucked beneath the collar of her ruined shirt was a thin silver chain. He'd seen it on the porch, but now, in the light, he saw the pendant clearly. It was a small, tarnished silver locket, oval-shaped. Engraved on the front were 2 letters, scrolled in an old style, L.V. He didn't know anyone with those initials, but he knew her. Now that the mud was gone, now that he saw her face clearly, he knew her. Arden Vale. He'd seen the wanted poster tacked to the wall in the Rattler post office 6 months ago. Wanted for arson and sedition, $500. He knew the story. Everyone in the basin did. She'd been a shearer, one of the best, working the massive flocks up at the Mesa of Ash. That was Matilda Crow's land. Crow owned the mesa, the water rights, and the bank. When her main granary burned to the ground, she'd needed someone to blame. She blamed Arden Vale, who'd been trying to organize the other hands for winter pay. They'd found kerosene-soaked rags under Vale's bunk. It was too neat. Even Coulter, who stayed out of everyone's business, thought it was too neat. Vale had vanished before the marshal could get a rope around her neck. But that was arson. The posse outside, they were hunting for assault, for robbery. The poster was old, The new talk was different. The assault on a wagon train. Coulter knew that wagon. It wasn't military. It was a freight wagon, owned by the Seven Spires Company. Carrying winter flour and beans, it was headed for the railroad crews, bypassing the miners in the hills who were going hungry because the company store had closed. Ardenvale hadn't attacked it. She and 2 others had unhitched the mules, rolled the wagon to the miners' camp, and cracked the barrels. The railroad called it robbing. The miners, in their damp, freezing tents, they called her the divider. He looked at the glass wound. He looked at her face, pale and exhausted. The salt depot. The salt Seven Spires was hoarding, planning to sell back to the ranchers at triple the price come winter. She hadn't been robbing. She'd been running. He was cleaning the wound with whiskey from his own flask. Arden hissed in her sleep, her whole body tensing. But she didn't wake. The sharp, clean smell of the alcohol cut through the smell of blood. He was threading a needle when the new sound came. It wasn't the search bell. It wasn't the posse. It was a sharp, official rap on his door. Knock, knock, knock. Coulter froze. The needle stopped halfway through the air. Arden's eyes flew open. This time, they weren't clouded with panic. They were sharp, lucid, and filled with absolute terror. A voice called through the thick wood. It wasn't a stranger. It was worse. It was Law, he knew. "Coulter, you in there? It's Jory Pike. Open up. Just need a word." Coulter looked at the woman bleeding on his floor. He looked at the barred door. He looked at the needle in his hand. He slowly, deliberately, raised one finger to his lips, signaling for an impossible, desperate silence. The heavy bar on the door had barely settled into its iron cradle when the knock came. It wasn't a tentative rap. It was the hard, official pound of knuckles that expected an answer. Knock, knock, knock. Coulter's blood didn't run cold. It turned to slush. He looked at Arden. Her eyes, wide and lucid, were fixed on the door. They were the eyes of a rabbit that had just heard the latch of its own hutch. "Jory Pike," the voice called again, muffled by the oak and the rain. "Coulter, open up." There was no time. The cabin had one room, a sleeping loft, and this kitchen. The loft was a death trap. He couldn't get her up the ladder. He looked at the hearth too exposed. His eyes landed on the dry goods pantry. It was a tall, deep cupboard built into the wall, smelling of burlap, dried apples, and tin. He didn't speak. He moved. He scooped her off the bearskin rug. A strangled gasp of pure agony was punched from her lungs. He put his hand over her mouth, fast. "Bite me if you have to," he whispered, his voice a low command. "Do not make a sound." She didn't bite. Her body went rigid, trying to absorb the torment of being moved with a fresh gash. He half carried, half dragged her the 4 steps, opened the pantry door, and shoved her inside. She collapsed onto a 50-pound sack of flour, a cloud of white dust rising around her. The knock came again, harder. "Rook, I know you're in there. I see the light." Coulter grabbed the needle he'd been threading and the flask of whiskey. He thrust them into her hands. Her fingers were clammy, weak. "Stitch it," he breathed, the words harsh. "Now, and quiet." He shut the door, plunging her into absolute, suffocating darkness. He took 2 deep breaths. He walked to the main door, his boots heavy on the floorboards. He smoothed his face, pulling on the mask of the solitary rancher, the man who cared for nothing. He lifted the bar. The door swung open. Deputy Jory Pike stood on the porch, his yellow slicker dripping, his hat pulled low. He was a young man, maybe 25, with a face that hadn't yet hardened to the land. He looked tired, wet and unhappy. "Jory," Coulter said. His voice was gravel. "You're a long way from Dryline on a night like this." Jory's eyes moved past Coulter, scanning the dim cabin interior. He saw the fire, the empty chair, the pot on the stove. The posse was through here. Jory said, It wasn't a question. "About 20 minutes back," Coulter replied, leaning against the doorframe. "He didn't invite him in. Said they were hunting for the folks that hit the Spires depot." "That's right." Jory looked down at the porch boards, his gaze sharp. The rain had washed away the worst of the blood, but the pine boards were still stained. A faint, dark map of Arden's collapse. "They said she was headed this way, said she was bleeding." Coulter shrugged. "The rain's been coming down for 3 hours. Jory, it's washing the whole basin clean. Any tracks that were here are halfway to the Alkali Flats by now." He paused, then gestured with his head. "Coffee's been on the boil since sundown. You look like you need it. Come in, get dry." It was a gamble. An invitation was a risk. A refusal was a suspicion. Jory hesitated, his eyes still on the stain, but the cold was real, and Coulter's coffee was known. "For a minute," Jory said, stepping up. "Just a minute." Coulter stepped back, giving him room. He didn't close the door. Inside the pantry, darkness was total. It smelled of canvas, raw potatoes, and the faint, sweet scent of dried apples. Arden was folded in half, her knees drawn up, her back pressed against the rough sawn planks. She heard the boots on the floor. A new voice. "Come in, get dry." The pain in her side was a living thing. It was a white-hot coal. She knew if she didn't close it, the cold and the infection would take her before morning. She couldn't faint, not now. She uncorked the whiskey flask with her teeth, the glass clinking against her molars. She poured a mouthful, held the raw spirit until her eyes watered, and swallowed. It hit her stomach like a fist. She poured the rest of the whiskey directly onto the gash. Her entire body arched. A silent scream trapped in her throat. She jammed the sleeve of her wool coat into her mouth, biting down on the wet, grimy fabric until her jaw ached. The burn was blinding. Tears streamed from her eyes, hot and salty, tracing paths through the dirt on her face. Her hands were shaking, viciously. She couldn't see the needle. She couldn't see the thread. She had to do it by feel. She gripped the needle, its eye already threaded by Coulter. She probed the edge of the wound with her left thumb, feeling the slick, torn flesh. She brought the needle to the skin. She heard Coulter's voice. Calm. "Just clumsy. Spooked by the posse, I guess." She pushed the needle in. It felt thick. It wasn't like sewing canvas. The skin resisted, then gave with a sickening, soft pop. Her stomach heaved. She bit down harder on the sleeve, tasting mud and wool. A single drop of salty sweat fell from her forehead and landed directly in the open wound. It was a new, sharp, crystalline agony on top of the searing fire of the whiskey. Her hand jerked, pulling the thread tight. One stitch. She had to do it again. "You always did read the wind. Rook," she heard Jory say, his voice farther away now. She repositioned the needle. She breathed in, slow, through her nose. She pushed. On the porch, Jory Pike had never made it past the threshold. He'd accepted the mug of coffee Coulter poured, but he stood in the doorway, letting the steam warm his face. His eyes, however, were cold. They weren't looking at the coffee stain. They were looking at the mud. Specifically, the mud splashed high on the outside of the doorframe, a good 3 feet off the ground. "That posse rode hard," Jory observed, sipping the coffee. "But they didn't ride that hard." Coulter was at the kitchen counter, his back to the deputy. "What's that?" "This mud," Jory said, pointing with his chin. "It's a high splash, an impact, like a horse falling, or a horse ridden to its limit and stopping on a dime." He looked at Coulter. Their horses were tired, but they weren't winded, and they came from the east. Coulter's heart was a slow, heavy drum. He needed to break the man's train of thought. He needed a sound. He reached up for the sack of beans on the shelf above the counter. His elbow accidentally connected with the large, earthenware jar of dried pinto beans next to it. The jar toppled. It hit the counter and then the floor with a heavy, final crack. The sound was explosive in the small cabin. A river of pinto beans scattered across the floorboards, rattling and rolling into every dark corner. "Damnation," Coulter swore, dropping to one knee. "Clumsy as a calf." Jory jumped, slopping coffee onto his glove. "You all right, Coulter?" Just rattled," Coulter said, scooping angrily at the beans. "This whole night, that alarm bell from Dryline makes a man jumpy." The distraction worked. Jory's intense focus on the mud was broken. He stepped back, laughing softly. "You're getting old. Rook." Coulter didn't look up. He kept sweeping beans with his hand. "Happens to all of us." "Jory." He looked over his shoulder. "That mud you're looking at, it's not from the posse. It's not even from a horse." Jory frowned. "Don't lie to me. Coulter, that's a hoof splash." "You're half right," Coulter said, sitting back on his heels. He used his deep, certain knowledge of the basin, the only currency he had. "You know, the wind's been blowing south by southwest for about 6 hours now, ever since the storm front moved in. So, that posse came from the east. Any splash from their horses would have been thrown north, against the porch railing. You see any mud there, no? That splash," he pointed, "is thrown east. That was me, this afternoon, maybe 3 o'clock, before the rain got heavy." "Doing what?" "Drove the last of the sheep down from the ridge. They spooked at the washout by the creek and bolted for the barn. Came fast. That's the splash from the lead U hitting the mud hollow by the steps. The wind caught the spray and threw it high, threw it east. You can check my sheep tracks in the barn, if you like. They'll be wet." It was a brilliant explanation. It was complex, specific, and relied on meteorology. It was so detailed, it had to be true. Jory Pike stared at the mud, at the wind blowing the rain past the door, and at Coulter Rook, a man known for being strange, but not for being a liar. He wanted to believe him. He had a whole valley to search, and this cabin was cold and full of spilled beans. "You always did read the wind." "Rook," Jory said. He handed the empty mug back. "All right, I'm moving on, but you lock this door behind me. The marshal, he's not in a good mood. They say this Vale woman is dangerous. Said she was part of that arson crew up at Crow's place." Coulter stood up, brushing bean dust from his trousers. "They say a lot of things. Jory, most of them are just air." "Maybe." Jory stepped back onto the porch, pulling his slicker tight. "Good night, Coulter." "Good night, Deputy." Coulter closed the door. He didn't bar it, not yet. He waited, listening, until the sound of Jory's horse faded, swallowed by the thunder. Then, and only then, did he drop the heavy oak bar into its brace. The sound was a final, echoing thud. He leaned his entire weight against the door, his forehead pressing against the cool wood. His heart was hammering so hard it hurt his ribs. He'd held his breath for so long he felt lightheaded. The first hurdle was passed. Then he remembered. He lunged for the pantry and ripped the door open. Arden tumbled out, falling onto the floor amid the scattered beans. She was chalk white, her lips blue. She was clutching her side, where a crude, thick line of black thread was sewn into her skin. The needle, still threaded, dangled from the last stitch. She was a mess of flour, mud, and cold sweat. He hauled her up, his hands gentle now, and half carried her to the single wooden chair at the table. She collapsed into it, shaking so violently the chair rattled on the floor. "He gone," she whispered. Her teeth were chattering. "He's gone," Coulter said. He grabbed the whiskey flask from her limp hand. It was empty. He got his own bottle from the high shelf. He didn't bother with a glass, just handed it to her. She drank, coughed, and drank again. The liquor seemed to stop the shaking, or at least slow it. "I didn't shoot anyone," she said, her voice raw. She was looking at him, her eyes burning with a desperate need to be believed. "At the depot, or the wagon, I don't carry a gun." "The glass," Coulter said, pointing to her side. The salt depot wasn't a depot, she said, her words coming fast, stumbling over each other. It was a storehouse. Our storehouse. Crow and the Seven Spires Company, they've been seizing provisions, flour, seed, medicine, from families that couldn't pay the new water tax. They called it collateral. They were stockpiling it, planning to sell it back to us at 10 times the price when the snow hits. Coulter's face remained stone. We went to take it back, to give it back. A guard, one of Crow's men, he tried to stop the wagon. He fell. The wagon hit a ditch and rolled. The lantern, it broke. That's the glass. She was breathing hard, the story costing her. He wasn't shot. He was cut, just like me. Coulter stared at her. The divider. This was the truth of it. They aren't hunting me because I stole salt, she said. She fumbled inside her wet shirt, her fingers struggling with a hidden pocket. She pulled out a small oilskin pouch, dark and soaked. She laid it on the table between them. It was heavier than it looked. They're hunting me because I stole this. She untied the leather thong. She unfolded the oilskin, revealing a thin ledger book, its cover stamped with the insignia of the Seven Spires Company. The title was embossed in gold Flint Water Basin Water Compensation Registry. Coulter opened it. The pages were filled with neat, cursive script. They were names, dozens of names. Jebediah Smith, Elias North, Samuel Thorne, the farmers and ranchers of the basin, his neighbors. And next to every name, a signature, releasing all prior water rights to the Seven Spires Company in exchange for a fair compensation, listed as $1. It's a lie, Arden whispered, her hand resting on the page. They're forged, all of them. They took the signatures from old freight manifests. Seven Spires is using this ledger to prove to the territorial government that they bought this valley, not strangled it. Coulter's hand, calloused and steady, began to tremble. He turned the page, and the next, he stopped, his breathing hitched. He saw the name, Rook, Sarah. He didn't need to check the signature. He knew it was a forgery. He knew because he'd been there. The memory wasn't a picture. It was a sound. The sound of his wife, Sarah, trying to breathe. A dry, rattling cough that echoed in the tiny bedroom. It was the smell of the creek bed, the stink of dead fish and baking mud. It was the feeling of helplessness as he watched the Seven Spires crew, protected by hired guns, drive the last pilings for their diversion dam, turning his water into a trickle, then into dust. He remembered riding to the foreman, begging, "Just 1 barrel. She has the fever. The doctor said she needs water." The foreman had spat tobacco juice onto the dry ground. "Water's for the railroad. Rook, your wife should have thought of that before she got sick." Sarah died 3 weeks later. The fever had passed, but the thirst had ruined her. She had died of a dry throat while he listened to the sound of their stolen river rushing away, miles to the south. He looked up from the book. He looked at Arden Vale. The exhaustion, the wound, the desperation. This wasn't her fight. This wasn't his cabin. This was his war. This ledger, this was the testament. This was the proof that Sarah hadn't died of a fever. She had been killed. The look in his eyes changed. The flat, detached neutrality was gone. It was replaced by something cold and hard and focused. Arden saw the shift. She mistook the coldness for anger, for fear. I have to go, she said, pushing herself up from the chair. I can't bring this on you. I've repaid your kindness with this. I'll go. She stood, swaying. The room spun. My horse. Your horse is dead, Coulter said, his voice flat. I heard her leg snap before you hit the porch. The news seemed to break something inside her, the last of her strength. Then I'll walk. She took 1 step toward the door. Her knee buckled, the crude stitches in her side, pulled by the movement, tore free. A fresh, dark bloom of red soaked through the linen. She gasped and pitched forward. Coulter caught her before she hit the floor. He lifted her, his arms easily taking her weight. She felt light as a corn husk. "You're not going anywhere," he said. The words were iron. "You can't even stand." He carried her to his own simple cot in the corner of the room, the one he hadn't slept in since Jory knocked. He laid her down gently. The cabin was silent, save for the fire's crackle and the unrelenting drum of the rain. The tension of the last hour hung in the air, thick as smoke. Then, a new sound. It cut through the night, thin and sharp, a metal shriek that defied the storm. It was not a bell. It was not a horse. It was a steam whistle. Arden's eyes, which had been closed in exhaustion, snapped open. "No," she breathed. They're not supposed to be this far. The track isn't finished." "What is that?" Coulter asked, moving to the window. "That's not the work crew whistle," she said, pulling herself up on one elbow, her face pale with a new, deeper dread. "That's the inspection engine. It's his whistle. Harlan Vetch, the chief inspector. He never leaves the main line. Not unless something is desperately wrong." Coulter stared out the window into the black, churning rain. The posse had been a nuisance. Jory Pike had been a danger. This was different. This was the railroad itself, bearing down on them. "This night," Coulter said, turning from the window and picking up the Spencer, "is just getting started." The night's rain had washed the air clean, but the metallic shriek of the steam whistle lingered in the basin, a scar on the new morning. Dawn broke gray and cold, the color of old ashes. Coulter hadn't slept. He'd spent the last hours of darkness at the table, heating his skinning knife in the coals. Arden was awake, propped against the wall on his cot, the oilskin ledger clutched to her chest. "This is going to hurt," Coulter said, not unkindly. He knelt beside her. The crude stitches she had jammed into her own side were already pulling, the skin around them an angry red. "It hurt before," she whispered. "This time it'll hurt proper." He cut her thread, pulled the old stitches free, and cleaned the gash again with the last of the whiskey. She didn't bite a coat this time. Her knuckles went white on the cot frame. Her jaw set so hard a muscle jumped, but she held the sound in. He worked with a shepherd's practical skill, his large hands steady, tying off each stitch with a clean, strong knot. He'd mended more sheep than he could count. This was no different. When he was done, he bandaged her tightly with a clean strip of flour sack. "It'll hold," he said, standing up. "It'll hold if you don't run, and we can't run." "That whistle," she said, her voice tight. "Vetch, they'll search every house." "Then we won't be in the house." Coulter pulled on his boots. "And you won't be a fugitive. You'll be a ranch hand. Vetch's men, they're railroaders. They're looking for someone hiding, someone scared. They don't know how to look at people who are working. Work is invisible." He put his wide-brimmed hat on her head. It fell low, shadowing her eyes. He handed her a bucket. "My milk cow. Bess is in the barn. She needs the creek. Go slow. A sore hand is a sore hand. That's all they'll see. I'll be on the ridge." The simple act of walking to the barn sent splinters of pain up her side. The hat smelled of him sun, leather, and coffee. She led the cow out. The morning air was thin. She moved stiffly, every step a calculation. From the high ground of Cinder Ridge, Coulter watched. He saw her, a small, slow-moving figure with the cow. He also saw the valley. The smoke from the inspection engine was a dirty plume rising from the south. But worse, much worse, was the checkpoint. Through his old spyglass, Coulter saw them. Harlan Vetch's men had occupied the serrated Ford Bridge. It wasn't a ragged posse anymore. This was an occupation. They had erected a proper timber barrier. 2 men in 7 Spires uniforms, armed with new rifles, were stopping a farm wagon, a 3rd man searching the back. Every road out of Flintwater Basin was corked. They were sealed in. He moved back down the ridge, meeting Arden as she returned from the creek. She was pale, leaning on the cow for support. "The bridge is held," he said, his voice flat. She looked at him, the fear in her eyes hardening into something else. Anger. "Then we're not getting to Rattler." "Not that way." "If we're trapped in here," she said, her mind working fast, "then the proof we need is trapped in here with us. That ledger, it's just names. Vetch will say it's a forgery, a fantasy." "It's the truth," Coulter said. "The truth needs a witness. We need something that ties those forged signatures to Vetch today. Something that shows they're actively using this fraud." Coulter thought of the steam whistle, the smell of coal smoke on the air. Vetch has a field office, near the new tracks. He's not just inspecting, he's directing the search. A field office? Arden's eyes narrowed. He'll have a clerk, someone writing the pay chits, the supply invoices. Someone writing the water bills. Coulter finished. They left the cow and moved to the barn. He showed her his signals, the silent language of a man who worked alone. He tapped the stall door. 3 quick, light reps. Danger. Freeze. He tugged the sleeve of his shirt once. Move. Change direction. "We need to get to that shanty," Coulter said, his voice low. "Now. While the fog is still in the ravines." They didn't take horses. Horses were loud, their tracks too clear. They moved on foot, heading south, staying in the deep erosion cuts and behind the thick stands of juniper. The path was a gray smoke path, a place where the morning fog and the coal smoke from the engine blended into a perfect, ghostly cover. They came up over a rise. Below them lay the railroad camp. It was a raw wound in the earth, a scar of fresh-cut timber, mud, and canvas tents. The inspection engine hissed on a siding, a metal beast in the mist. "The shanty," Arden whispered, pointing. It was a small, pine-board structure, separate from the tents, with a stovepipe puffing smoke. A man in a waistcoat came out, stretched, and walked toward the mess tent. "The clerk," Coulter said. "That's our chance." They moved down the scree slope, a treacherous slide of loose rock. Their boots sent small cascades of gravel rattling down. They froze, but the camp was filled with the rhythmic clang, clang, clang of a hammer on steel. They timed their movements to the sounds, a desperate, offbeat rhythm. They reached the shanty. The door was unlocked. Coulter eased it open. The air inside was suffocating stale cigar smoke, boiled coffee, and the sharp, acidic smell of ink. A pot-bellied stove radiated a dry, intense heat. It was a mess of papers, manifests, and maps. "Invoices," Arden muttered, shuffling through a stack on the desk. "Pay chits, timber receipts." Coulter's eyes scanned the room. He was looking for something specific. He saw it, sitting in a wooden block on the desk, gleaming in the dim light, a heavy, steel-nibbed fountain pen. He picked it up. It was cold, weighted. Etched into the silver band was an inscription, property of 7 Spires Surveying, serial number 42. "Arden," he said. She was unfolding a crumpled piece of paper she'd pulled from a waste bin. "Coulter, look." It was a draft, an invoice, written in a hurried, angry script. To Elias North, for water tariff. Flint water access. Amount due $30. Elias North. His name was in the ledger. "He's charging them," Arden breathed, her voice trembling with rage. "He's charging them for the water he already stole, using the forged ledger as proof of ownership. And he's doing it with this." Coulter held up the pen. The ink on its nib was the same deep, indigo blue as the invoice. It was the same ink as the forged signatures in the ledger. They had it. The pen, the invoice, the ledger, the complete story of the crime, from beginning to end. "We go," Coulter said, sliding the pen into his pocket. Arden folded the invoice, tucking it into the oilskin pouch with the ledger. They slipped out the door. The fog was lifting. The sun, weak as it was beginning to burn it away. The camp was waking up. They were halfway up the scree slope, back in the loose rock, when they heard the voices. "Told you I heard something," a man said, his voice directly below them. Coulter didn't think. He reacted. He grabbed Arden by the front of her coat, hauled her off her feet, and slammed her into a shallow limestone nook, a vertical crack in the rock face. His body pressed her into the cold, jagged stone. The impact stole her breath. Her bandaged wound screamed. A silent, white-hot flash of agony. He was on top of her, caging her in. His left hand was splayed against the rock by her head. His right hand clamped hard over her mouth. She could feel his heart hammering against her chest. Or maybe it was hers. The air was filled with the scent of his coat, the dust from the rock. His beard brushed her temple as he angled his head. Listening. They heard the crunch of boots on gravel. 2 men, 7 Spires guards, their rifles slung. They stopped not 5 feet from the nook. "Just a rock slide. Silas," one said. "This whole damned hill's loose." "Maybe." The one called Silas sounded unconvinced. He scanned the hillside. Arden's eyes were squeezed shut, her breath trapped and hot behind Coulter's hand. Then, the first guard sighed. "I'm not climbing up there to chase a rabbit. Besides, Vetch has me walking till my bladders burst." There was the sound of the man unfastening his trousers. A moment later, a hot, steaming stream splashed against the limestone. Just inches from Coulter's boot, the acrid smell hit them both. A sharp, sudden intimacy of pure disgust. Arden didn't flinch. Coulter didn't move a muscle. He was a statue of granite, pressing her into the rock. The man finished, shaking himself. "All right, let's get back to the coffee. I'm freezing." "Vetch pays," Silas grumbled. "I walk." They watched the 2 men move off, their footsteps fading. Coulter didn't move. He counted to 30. His breath held. Then he slowly eased his hand from her mouth and pushed himself back. Arden slumped against the rock, gasping, her legs shaking too hard to hold her. The pain in her side was a dull, throbbing sickness. "He almost," she breathed, wiping her mouth. "He didn't," Coulter said. His voice was rough. "Move, now, before the sun is high." He used the opportunity, while they were high on the ridge, to point out their escape. He traced a line with his finger, down the back of his property, far from the camp. "That's an erosion gully," he said. "Only shepherds know it. It's steep and it's slick, but it cuts behind the ridge and bypasses the serrated ford. It'll put us 5 miles south of Vetch's blockade." They made it back to the ranch. The adrenaline was fading, leaving Arden trembling. Coulter knew they couldn't wait. Vetch was a spider, and his web was closing. "We leave at dusk," he said. "We'll take the old mule. Jubal. A horse is too proud for that gully. A mule is stubborn. He'll get us through." They spent the next hour preparing. Coulter filled saddlebags with dried beef, hardtack, and a box of Spencer cartridges. Arden in the barn rewrapped the ledger, the pen, and the invoice, securing the oilskin pouch deep inside a sack of feed. She was checking the buckles on Jubal's harness when she heard the horse. It wasn't a patrol. It was a single rider, moving with a calm, unhurried gait. Coulter stepped out of the house, wiping his hands on a rag, looking every bit the irritated rancher. Arden watched through a crack in the barn door. A man in a clean black duster and a crisp, flat-brimmed hat reined his horse in, 10 feet from the porch. He was flanked by 2 guards, the same men from the scree slope. "Harlan Vetch," Arden breathed, her hand instinctively going to the hilt of the knife on her belt. "Him. Mr. Rook," Vetch said. His voice was not loud, but it carried, it was smooth, like oiled steel. "A pleasure. I am Harlan Vetch, Chief Inspector for the 7 Spires Company." "Inspector," Coulter said. He didn't move from the porch. Vetch dismounted. Pulling off his gloves, he looked around the hardscrabble yard, his gaze lingering on the dry, empty creek bed. "I've been reviewing the basin survey. This is a stubborn piece of land you have here." "It stands," Coulter said. "It does, for now." Vetch walked onto the porch, uninvited. He took 2 documents from his inside coat pocket. One was a thick, folded contract, heavy with seals. The other was a bank envelope, thick with cash. He placed them both on the small table by Coulter's rocker. "The company is generous. Mr. Rook, we value good neighbors. We are prepared to offer you $500 cash for this plot and all its structures. A fair price, considering the difficulties of ranching in a dry basin." Arden held her breath. $500. It was a fortune. It was enough for Coulter to leave this land, to buy a new life. She watched his back, waiting for him to move, to speak. Coulter looked at the envelope. He thought of the empty chair inside his house. He thought of the sound of his wife's dry cough. He thought of the name Sarah Rook in the ledger. A low, cold sound rumbled in his chest. It was almost a laugh. "My land's not for sale." Harlan Vetch's smile didn't falter. He simply picked up the envelope and the contract, tapping them lightly against his gloved hand. "The land isn't Mr. Rook, I understand." He smiled. A thin, dry parting of the lips. He nodded toward the dusty, cracked bed of the creek. "But the water is mine. In the barn." Arden saw the words. She saw the absolute, confident arrogance of the man. She saw Coulter's hands clench into fists at his sides. She drew her knife from its sheath. The blade was dark, oiled, and ready. Harlan Vetch's horse left tracks in the mud that seemed to steam with arrogance. He rode away, a man who owned the very water in the clouds, leaving Coulter standing on the porch, a king of nothing but dust. In the barn, Arden lowered the knife. She had seen the look on Coulter's face. It was the look he'd had when he read Sarah's name in the ledger, a quiet, terrible stillness that was more dangerous than any shout. The adrenaline that had held her upright on the scree slope, that had kept her hand steady in the clerk's shanty, drained away. It left a vacuum, and the pain of her wound rushed in to fill it. A deep, sickening throb began, a pulsing heat that had nothing to do with the day. When Coulter turned, he didn't go back into the house. He walked to the barn, his face a mask of stone. He found her leaning against Jubal, the mule, her forehead pressed into the animal's coarse mane. She was shivering. "Arden." She looked up. Her face was pale, but 2 sharp, unnatural flags of red burned high on her cheekbones. Her eyes were too bright. The plan," she stammered, her teeth chattering. "Dusk. We have to go at dusk." Coulter put his bare hand to her forehead, brushing the hat back. His palm was calloused and rough, but it felt impossibly cool. Her skin was a furnace. "The infection's set," he said, his voice flat. He'd seen it in sheep, seen it in men. "That gully will kill you before the first mile." He didn't wait for an argument. He slid one arm behind her back and the other under her knees, lifting her as he had the night before. This time, she was conscious, and she made a low sound of protest and pain. "Put me down. Coulter, I can walk. I'm just cold." "You're on fire," he said, carrying her out of the barn. The sky, which had cleared for Vetch's visit, had closed in again. A low, gray ceiling of cloud opened up, and a fine, cold mist began to fall. Not a hard rain, but a soaking drizzle that promised to last for days. He carried her into the house. The hearth was low, the embers barely glowing. He laid her on the bearskin rug where she had first woken, then piled logs onto the fire, stoking it until flames licked up the chimney. She shivered violently, the tremors racking her body. "I'm a burden, Rook. You should have let me go." "Be quiet," he said. It wasn't unkind. It was an order. He filled a tin cup with water from the barrel, but her hands were shaking too hard to hold it. He knelt beside her, slid his arm behind her shoulders, and lifted her head, holding the cup to her lips. She drank greedily, the water cold against her hot throat. When he laid her back down, her breathing was still wrong. It was shallow, fast, and hitched every second or two. It was the breathing of panic, but this time, the panic was internal. It was her body fighting itself. "You're racing," he said, sitting back on his heels. "You're breathing like you're still on that scree slope." She tried to answer, but her teeth chattered. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. He had seen this before. He had sat by a cot, in this very room, and watched a fever steal the breath from a woman he loved. He had been helpless then. He would not be helpless now. He pulled off his heavy work gloves, tossing them aside. He took her right hand. It was hot and dry. He didn't just hold it, he guided it. He placed her palm flat against his own chest, over his heart. Her eyes, clouded with fever, widened slightly. "Feel that," he said, his voice a low rumble. "That's steady, that's not running." He held her hand firmly against him. "Now breathe with it, match me." He took a slow, deep breath, his chest rising and falling under her hand. In, out. "Stop fighting the air. Arden, just breathe. With me. Thump, thump in. Thump, thump out." She stared at his face, trying to focus. Her breathing was a frantic, bird-like flutter. But under her palm, she felt it, the slow, powerful, unwavering beat. It was an anchor in the storm of her fever. It was a rock. She tried to match him. Her first breath was a shuddering gasp, but she held it. "Thump, thump." She let it out. "Again," he commanded, his voice soft. She closed her eyes. She shut out the pain in her side, the fear of Vetch, the sound of the rain. She focused on the only thing in the world that was solid, the steady rhythm of Coulter Rook's heart, beating against her hand. Thump, thump. Her shoulders, which had been hunched around her ears, began to drop. The tight knot of panic in her own chest, a knot that had been there for a year, began to loosen. Her breathing slowed, deepened, falling into cadence with his. The frantic, shivering terror subsided, replaced by a vast, bone-deep exhaustion. When she opened her eyes again, the wildness was gone. She was just looking at him. The warmth from his chest was real, a steady heat that traveled up her arm and settled her. They stayed like that for a long time. The only sound in the cabin, the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the rain against the glass. "They take everything," she said, her voice a hoarse whisper. Coulter didn't move, kept her hand pressed to his heart. "What's that?" "They take it all." She looked at the ledger, sitting on the table, a silent witness. "They took your wife." He didn't speak. His jaw tightened, the muscle along his cheek pulling, but he just nodded. Sarah, she was in the ledger. They locked your water. The fever came." "It wasn't the fever," Coulter said, his voice so low she barely heard it. "The fever breaks. Everyone knows that. It was the dryness. She burned up. There was no water to cool her. I sat here. I listened to the creek bed crack, and I listened to her." He stopped. "They took her life," Arden whispered. "And they took my name. They branded me, arsonist, thief, outlaw. I look at my hands, and I don't know whose they are." Coulter finally let go of her hand, but he didn't move away. He sat, watching the firelight play on her face. "You know what I'm afraid of?" she asked, her voice stronger now. "More than Vetch, more than a noose in Rattler." She looked around the small, warm cabin. At the cot in the corner. "Peace, the quiet. I'm afraid that if I lie down, if I actually rest, really rest, Peace will just get up and walk out the door before I wake. It'll leave me behind. It always does." Coulter was silent for a long moment. He watched the flames. He thought of the 2 years he had spent in this cabin, surrounded by silence, but with no peace at all. just an empty space. Peace doesn't walk out, Arden, he said finally, his gaze settling on her. It's not a visitor. It only stays if it's invited to sit, and you haven't sat down in a year. He stood, walked to his cot, and pulled the old, heavy wool quilt from it. He came back and draped it over her shoulders, tucking it in around her. It was a simple, protective gesture. It was practical, but it was also kind. The simple kindness, after so much running, broke something in her. The fever, the fear, the exhaustion, it all crested. She looked up at him. He was just a man, a widower, his face carved by grief and the wind, his hands rough from work. He was as tired as she was. He was just lost, like her. She didn't think. She reached up, her hand sliding from his chest to his shoulder, and she leaned in. It wasn't a lunge. It was a slow, hesitant question. Her lips, chapped and hot from the fever, met his. It was brief. It was chaste. It was not a kiss of passion, but of desperate, mutual recognition. It tasted of coffee and wood smoke and the cold rain. A shared, silent acknowledgement of all the things they had lost. She pulled back, but only an inch. She rested her forehead against his. Her eyes closed. His beard was rough against her skin. They stayed there, simply breathing, the shared rhythm they had found earlier. In, out. A sudden, sharp squawk and a flutter of wings from the chicken coop outside broke the stillness. A fox, maybe, or just the wind. The spell was broken. They both pulled back, the air between them suddenly charged. A small, ghosts of a smile touched the corner of Coulter's mouth. "The chickens," he said, his voice rough. "They don't like foxes." "Or quiet," Arden whispered. He looked at her, his eyes clear. "We have a long road." "The gully," she said, the practical, desperate energy returning. "We can't go at dusk. We'll wait for the fever to break. But we can still go." "Go where?" Arden to Rattler. "To wave this ledger and a pen, they'll laugh us into a cell." I'm not just asking you to help me run," she said, her voice finding a new strength. The moment of peace, of being seen, had settled her. "I'm asking to stay, not just till the fever breaks, until this is done." Coulter frowned. "Stay here, Vetch knows this place. He'll be back." "Then we fight him, not like this." She clutched the ledger. "This is just paper. The pen is just metal. We need people. We need the names in this book to talk. We need to fight this, Coulter, not just escape it." He looked at her for a long time. He saw the woman who had stitched her own wound in the dark, the woman who had faced down Vetch's clerk, the woman who had just confessed her fear of peace. He saw the iron in her. He nodded, slowly. "All right," he said. "We stay. We fight. But we do it my way, not her way." He nodded toward the memory of Matilda Crow, the arson, the wanted poster. "We do it right. We do it clean. No ambushes. No gunfights in the dark. I want the children in this valley, the ones who are still here. I want them to grow up hearing about the law. I want them to know it worked, just once. Not that we just spilled more blood." Arden let out a breath she'd been holding for a year. "Clean," she agreed. Who do we get?" The fever seemed to recede, replaced by a sharp, focused energy. They were two strategists now. Coulter grabbed a piece of charcoal from the hearth and a spare scrap of wrapping paper. "Elias North," Coulter said, writing the name. "The invoice you found, he runs the brick kiln. He's stubborn. He hates spires, but he's scared. He'll talk if we're standing with him." "Jedediah Smith," Arden said, the name coming fast. "He's in the ledger. He was the ditch master for the whole basin before Spires. Well, before. He knows where every old survey marker is. He can prove the maps are lies." "Old preacher Ephraim Cutlass," Coulter added. He's a man of God, but he's also the county assessor. He was forced to sign off on the land transfers. He's a weak man, but his guilt might be strong. He knows Crow paid for those forged signatures. He watched it happen. They had a list. They had a new plan, not just to run, but to rally. The mood in the cabin had shifted. It was no longer a refuge. It was a war room. A new sound cut through the drizzle, shattering the quiet. It was the steam whistle, but it wasn't the long, lonely cry of the inspection engine. It was 3 sharp, frantic bursts. Weep, weep, weep. Coulter was at the window in an instant. Arden struggled to her feet, clutching the quilt. "What is that? That's not the search signal." "No," Coulter said, his voice grim. He stared into the darkening, misty evening. On the far ridge, where the track was being laid, a dozen lanterns bobbed in the gloom. "That's the work crew signal. That's all hands." "At night," Arden said, joining him. "In the rain, they can't lay track in this." "They're not laying track," Coulter said. He pointed. "They're grading. They're moving earth. They're working double time." He looked at the list of names on the table. He looked at Arden. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Vetch isn't waiting. He's accelerating the schedule. The territorial hearing, the one in Rattler, where he has to present this ledger, it was set for the end of the month. "He's moving it up," Arden breathed, her blood running cold. "He's going to ram it through before we can talk to anyone." "We don't have till the end of the month, Arden," Coulter said, his hand closing into a fist. "We don't even have a week. That kind of work, that's a 3-day push. We have 3 days, maybe less." The 3-day fuse had been lit. The steam whistle from the Spire's work camp was a constant, shrieking punctuation to the cold, misty days. Harlan Vetch was accelerating. He was forcing the land hearing in Rattler. Coulter stood by the cabin window, watching the rain. "He'll call the hearing. He'll present his forged ledger, the one you stole. He'll say it's the only record. Then he'll show the new survey maps, the ones that give Spires the water. The territorial judge, Cutlass. He'll sign. And then," Arden said, her voice thin but hard, "he'll destroy the real evidence, the other books, the original county land registry, the one that proves who owned what before 7 Spires even existed. He'll burn it, and our book with it. It'll be just smoke." Her fever had broken, leaving her weak but with a sharp, brittle clarity. "So, we need 3 things," Coulter said, turning from the window. 1, we need the real, official 7 Spires corporate seal, the embosser, your ledger. He tapped the oilskin pouch on the table. "It's got a seal, but I'll bet my life it's a forgery. If we have an impression of the real one, we can prove in court that yours is a lie." 2, Arden picked up. "We need that original county registry. The book Vetch will try to burn. We have to save it, and 3, Coulter finished. "We need to force Vetch's hand in public. He wants a quiet, clean hearing. We need to fill that room with every rancher and miner in this basin. We need to make it loud." The plan was desperate. It was a 3-pronged attack, and it started at Visson Station. "Visson Station is Vetch's field office," Arden said, thinking fast. "It's where he's running the work crews. It's where the safe is. And the safe is where the seal is." Coulter said, "Getting in is the problem." "Not if you're supposed to be there," Arden said. "I heard the guards at the gully. Their cook, a man named Silas. He quit, took a fever. They've been eating cold pork and hardtack for 2 days. They're complaining loud." Coulter looked at her. You can barely stand." "I don't have to be a good cook. I just have to be a present cook. I'll wear a veil. Say I was in a kitchen fire. The smoke hurt my lungs. It'll hide my face. It'll make my voice sound rough." Coulter stared at her. "And me." "The stables," she said, her eyes bright. "The railroad horses at Visson need hay. You're a rancher. You're just a man, delivering hay." It was a plan built on twine and nerve. The next morning, they put it in motion. Arden, wrapped in a heavy, dark gray shawl that Coulter's wife had owned, her face hidden by a thick linen veil, approached the Weizen station foreman. The station was a muddy chaos of tents, lumber, and men. She looked small, frail, and unimportant. I'm looking for work," she rasped, a dry cough catching in her throat. "I can cook." The foreman, a big man with a face like cured leather, spat tobacco. "You look like you're half dead, ma'am." "I make biscuits," she whispered, "and I can boil coffee. The steam helps my chest. I need the work." He was desperate. His men were mutinous over the food. Fine. The kitchen is in the back of the main office. Vetch's office. Don't go in there. Don't burn the place down. And stay out of the way." She was in... The kitchen was a small, hot room that smelled overwhelmingly of old, congealed bacon grease and boiled-over coffee. The air was thick. Through a flimsy wooden door, she could see Vetch's office. It was empty. And on the wall, right by the stovepipe, hung a small, iron key. It was tied to its hook with a piece of greasy, pink butcher's twine. The arrogance of it. Vetch didn't fear his own hungry, overworked men. He left the key to his safe hanging where the cook could find it. Arden began to work, making noise. She slammed iron pots. She stoked the wood stove, sending a plume of fresh smoke up the chimney. She was waiting. 10 minutes later, Coulter arrived. He drove the rickety buckboard, pulled by their old gray mule, Jubal, right into the center of the camp. He looked exactly like what he was, a tired rancher, delivering a meager pile of hay. "Where you want this?" he yelled to a stable hand. "By the back," the hand yelled back. "By the office porch, and stack it dry." Coulter backed the cart up. He saw the 2 armed guards on the back porch of the office, Vetch's personal watch. They were supposed to be guarding the office, but they were watching him, bored. "This blasted axle," Coulter muttered, loud enough for them to hear. He got down, kicking the wheel. "Mule's gone lame, and the axle's cracked." He began to unload the hay, stacking it near the stable, but he left one large, dry bale sitting on the cart. He looked at the sky. He pulled his pipe from his pocket. "Mind if I take a smoke?" he called to the guards. "Just get the hay moved," one of them snapped. Coulter leaned against the cart. Near the last bale, he struck a match against the wheel rim. He lit his pipe, puffing. A man taking a well-deserved break. He puffed for a full minute, letting the guards get used to him. Then, he tripped over the wagon tongue. He stumbled forward, catching himself against the dry bale. As he did, he dumped the entire hot, glowing contents of his pipe bowl ash, embers, and burning tobacco deep into the heart of the hay. He didn't look back. He just went back to stacking the other bales. "Nearly done," he called out. It took 30 seconds. A wisp of white smoke, then a thicker, oily, gray plume. The bale wasn't just hay. Coulter had packed it with damp leaves and pine needles. It didn't flame. It smoldered. A thick, choking cloud of smoke poured out. "Fire!" one of the guards yelled. "The stable! It's the stable!" the other one shouted, his eyes wide. The stable was full of the company's expensive horses. "Get water. Get the buckets from the trough." The porch was forgotten. The office was forgotten. Both guards dropped their rifles and ran, sprinting for the water trough 100 yards away. The back of the office was clear. Arden heard the shouts. "Now!" She moved from the kitchen. The key was rough in her hand. She slipped into Vetch's office. It smelled of cold cigars, leather, and ink. The safe was a black, iron box. She put the key in. It grated, then turned. Click. The heavy door swung open. Inside stacks of currency, coin bags, and papers. She saw it. A thick, leather-bound ledger. The original Flintwater County Registry. And beside it, a slim file. Water for land exchange agreements. She grabbed the file. It was a list of all the families. Like the Norths, who had been forced to sell, their signatures confirming they'd sold their land for due compensation, a few dollars in salt. It was the proof of the conspiracy. Then she saw the embosser. It was a heavy cast-iron press, the real seal. She didn't have time to steal it. She pulled a small block of beeswax from her pocket, the kind shepherds use for waterproofing thread. She opened the press. She put the wax inside. She threw her entire frail weight onto the handle. She pulled the wax out. Embossed in it was a perfect, sharp image, the 7 spires hawk, its wings spread. She counted the tail feathers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. She pulled out her own stolen ledger. The forged seal on its cover had only 5. She had it. The wax impression. The exchange file. The pen was already in Coulter's pocket. She had the whole story. She turned to leave. A woman was standing in the doorway to the kitchen. She was tall, dressed in a severe, beautiful traveling coat of black wool, the collar trimmed with iridescent crow feathers. She smelled, overpoweringly, of wildflowers, a sweet, cloying scent of violets that cut through the smell of lard and smoke. It was Matilda Crow. Arden froze. Her veil was still down. She was just the cook. "You've made a terrible mess," Matilda Crow said. Her voice was like cold silver. She looked past Arden, at the open safe. "And you are in the wrong room, girl." Arden's mind raced. She clutched the wax and the file. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Arden rasped, her voice a low cough. I was looking for the dry bin, for the flour." "Vetch is a fool," Crow said, ignoring her. She stepped into the office. "He's careless. He leaves his entire fortune where a soot-covered kitchen girl can find it." Her eyes narrowed. "What is that in your hand?" Arden had to make a choice, the file or the wax. The shouts outside grew louder. "More water, it's spreading!" "Ma'am," Arden yelled, faking a new panic. "The fire! It's near the oil shed. We have to—" She sacrificed the file. She shoved the water for land exchange papers back into the safe, as if in a panic, but the small, hard block of wax remained clenched in her fist. The diversion worked. Crow looked outside, annoyed. "Fools! This entire operation is run by fools." Arden, playing the part of the terrified servant, scrambled past her, back into the heat and smoke of the kitchen. "Vetch thinks this is his," Matilda Crow said, almost to herself. She smiled, a thin, satisfied expression. "He thinks this is about tracks and engines. This railroad, it's just a key, and when it passes through, this entire county," she tapped a map on Vetch's desk, "will be in my pocket." Arden didn't wait. She grabbed a sooty pot and ran out the back door, into the smoky chaos, disappearing into the crowd of shouting men. She found Coulter by the stables. The burning bale was a sodden, smoking mess. "Go!" he yelled, not looking at her. "Knife Edge Gully, now." She ran. Coulter, the dutiful citizen, grabbed a bucket and helped put out the last of the embers. Then, in the confusion, he walked away from the station, not toward his ranch, but toward the small cluster of buildings that made up the Vyson settlement. He stopped at the public message board outside the closed assessor's office. With a thick piece of chalk, he wrote, his letters large and angry. "Land hearing. Rattler. 3 days. Bring your papers. Bring your deeds. All papers. Tell your neighbors." He didn't sign it. He didn't have to. He dropped the chalk and walked away, disappearing into the mist. He met Arden an hour later at the mouth of Knife Edge Gully. It was a dark, narrow fissure in the rock, barely wide enough for the mule. The sun was gone. Night was falling fast. Jubal, the mule, balked at the entrance. "Did you get it?" Coulter asked, his voice low. "Crow!" Arden panted, her hand on her stitched side. "She was there. I had to leave the exchange file. But—" She opened her fist. The wax impression was perfect. I got the seal. It's enough, Coulter said. It's the proof. Let's go. He grabbed Jubal's harness and pulled the stubborn mule into the gully. The walls rose up, hundreds of feet, blocking the sky. It was instantly cold. From the rocks above, a wolf howled, a long, lonely hunting cry that echoed down the canyon. Jubal panicked. The mule, terrified by the sound and the enclosed space, shied violently, rearing back. The path was slick with moss and rain. He slipped. The mule's hind legs went out, and he crashed onto the slick, wet stones of the gully floor. He wasn't hurt, but the jolt was violent. The saddlebag on Jubal's flank, the one Arden had so carefully packed, was slammed against a sharp outcrop of granite. The leather buckle tore. The oilskin pouch, the one holding the forged ledger, the invoice, the pen, all of their primary evidence flew out. It landed with a soft, sick plop in the black, rushing stream that ran through the bottom of the Gaby Sea. "No!" Arden screamed. The current was fast. It grabbed the pouch and spun it away, a dark shape in the dark water, rushing into the night. Arden didn't think. She lunged. She threw herself off the path into the freezing, waist-deep water. Her fingers brushed the oilskin. She missed. The current, icy and powerful, ripped her feet out from under her. Her head went under, and the black water swallowed her whole. The world was black, cold, and moving too fast. Arden felt the icy water of the gully stream close over her head, a suffocating liquid punch that drove the air from her lungs. The current was a vicious, powerful hand, spinning her, dragging her down. Her boot caught on a submerged rock, twisting her ankle, but the water tore her free. She was blind. Her only thought was the ledger, the pen, the wax, all of it, washing away into the dark. Then another hand, this one warm and human, clamped down on the collar of her coat. It wasn't gentle. It was a desperate, violent yank. Coulter had plunged in after her without a second thought. He hadn't lunged for the pouch. He'd lunged for her. He got a fistful of her coat and his feet under him, bracing against the torrent. The water was waist-deep and numbing, trying to pull them both down. "I've got you," he roared, his voice swallowed by the rush of the gully. He hauled her backward, fighting the current, his boots slipping on the slick, mossy stones. He dragged her, sputtering and choking, toward the bank. He threw her more than helped her onto the narrow strip of wet grass and gravel. He crawled out after her, collapsing onto his chest. For a full minute, neither of them moved. They just lay there, 2 feet apart, gasping, the sound of their breathing a ragged counterpoint to the roar of the water. The icy rain began to fall again, pinning them to the earth. Arden coughed, water streaming from her nose and mouth. The book," she choked, pushing herself up onto her elbows. "Coulter, the book." "Damn the book. Woman, you almost—" "No!" She scrambled to her feet, her eyes wild, scanning the black water. "It's everything. It's Sarah. It's—" She saw it, a dark, sodden shape, snagged on a tangle of roots just downstream, bobbing in the current. She lunged for it, half falling back into the stream, and grabbed it. She clutched the oilskin pouch to her chest and staggered back to the bank, her hands shaking so hard she could barely work the leather thong. "It's ruined," she whispered, her voice cracking. It's all just ink and water." Coulter was beside her now, his hand on his knee, breathing hard. "You waterproofed it." "Not enough. Not for this." She got the thong undone. She unfolded the oilskin. The pouch itself was soaked, heavy, but inside, the ledger was wrapped in a thick, waxy cloth, a piece of canvas Coulter had used to store his beeswax for his ropes. It was smeared and stiff, but it had held. She opened the ledger. The pages were damp at the edges, but the ink was clear. The names were still there, the forged signatures. She fumbled in the pouch. The serial-numbered pen was there, and wrapped in a small rag, hard and perfect, was the wax impression of the real seven-feathered seal. It was all there. It was safe. Arden stared at it. She looked at the gully. She looked at Coulter, who was soaked to the bone, his hair plastered to his face. A sound came out of her. It was a strange, choked sound. It was half a sob, half a bark of pure, hysterical laughter. The tension of the last year, the chase, the branding, the hunger, the fall from the horse, the glass, the knife, the fire. And now the water, it all broke at once. She sank to her knees, clutching the book, and laughed until the laughter turned into shuddering, gasping sobs. She wasn't crying from sadness. She was crying because, for the first time, they hadn't lost. Coulter stood over her, the rain dripping from his hat. He didn't try to stop her. He let her break. He waited until the sobs quieted, until she was just kneeling in the mud, breathing. Then he knelt in front of her. He didn't say, "It's all right." He didn't say, "We have to go." He just put his large, calloused hand on the side of her face. He used his thumb to wipe the mix of tears and river water from her cheek. And then he leaned in and pressed his forehead to hers. He didn't kiss her lips. He held her head steady, his forehead pressed against hers, his eyes closed. It was a long, silent moment. It was a promise. It was an anchor. It was a shared breath in the middle of a storm. "I am here. We are here." "Come on," he said at last, his voice rough. "We'll founder in this cold. We can't stay here." He got Jubal back on his feet. The mule was shaken but unharmed. He knew this gully. He knew every crack. "There's a shepherd's hovel, up the side canyon. It's not much, but it's out of the wind." It was a three-sided lean-to, a small space dug out of the rock, roofed with sod. It was barely tall enough to stand in, but it was dry. He tied Jubal to a scrub pine outside and pushed Arden in. She was shivering violently now, the adrenaline gone, the icy water seeping into her bones. Her wound, soaked and stressed, was a fire on her side. "You have to get out of those clothes," he said. He rummaged in his saddlebag. He had one dry wool shirt and a single, folded sheepskin. His bedroll. It wasn't much. "Turn around," she chattered, her teeth knocking together. Coulter didn't argue. He took the sheepskin and spread it on the dry, dusty floor. He put the shirt beside it. Then he turned his back to her, standing in the narrow, 3-foot opening of the hovel, a dark silhouette against the gray. Stormy night. He faced the wind, his rifle in his hand, standing guard. It was the most profound gesture of respect she had ever been shown. He heard the rustle of wet, heavy clothes falling to the dirt floor. He heard the sharp, painful intake of her breath as the cold air hit her skin, and the small, pained grunt as she pulled the dry shirt over her wound. He heard her teeth chattering, a sound like rattling dice. "It's done," she whispered. He turned. She was sitting on the sheepskin, wrapped in his shirt, which was huge on her, the sleeves rolled up. She had the heavy wool quilt from his cot, now damp, wrapped around her, but she was still shaking. "That's not enough," Coulter said, his voice grim. "The cold will take you before morning." He built a tiny, smoking fire of dry sticks just outside the opening. It gave off more smoke than heat. He sat by the fire, feeding it, his back to her. An hour passed. The chattering from the lean-to didn't stop. He cursed, low and soft. He stood up, grabbed the sheepskin, and dragged it next to the fire, where the smoke was less but the heat was more. "Sit here." She moved, huddling on the fleece. It wasn't enough. He sighed. He sat down on the sheepskin, his back against the rock wall. "All right, move." She looked at him. "Move. There's only one of these. We share the heat, or you die. It's that simple." She hesitated, then slid onto the sheepskin, her back to his. They sat like that, two rigid, separate spines, passing warmth between them. But the night was deep, and the cold was a predator. Finally, he spoke, his voice rumbling through his back into hers. "This is foolish." He turned. "Face me." She turned. They were sitting cross-legged on the small fleece, their knees almost touching, the firelight flickering on their faces. "Lie down," he said. It was an order. He lay on his side, on the hard dirt, giving her the full width of the sheepskin. She lay on her side, facing him. They were 2 feet apart, the space between them cold. The shivering was still racking her body, with a sound of pure frustration. Coulter moved onto the sheepskin, pressing his body against her back, spooning her, pulling the damp quilt over both of them. "Stop, just stop shaking," he muttered. His body was a furnace. He was solid, warm, and real. His arm came around her, pulling the quilt tight, his hand resting on her waist, far from her wound. She could feel his steady breathing against her hair. The shaking, it didn't stop, but it slowed. She let her own stiff spine relax, melting back into his warmth. She was safe. The thought was so foreign, so startling, that a fresh, quiet tear slipped from her eye. She thought he was asleep, but then his hand moved. He didn't grope. He simply laced his fingers with hers, the one resting on her stomach. His thumb stroked the back of her hand. She turned in his arms. Now they were face to face, so close their breath mingled in the cold air. The fire was just embers, a dull red glow that lit the planes of his face. He looked tired. He looked human. Neither of them spoke. The wind howled in the gully. The wolf cried again, farther away. He lifted his hand, the one not holding hers. He touched her face, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw, pushing a damp strand of hair back from her temple. The air in the tiny hovel grew thick. It was suddenly hot. She wasn't cold anymore. He leaned in. It was slow. It was a question. She met him halfway. The kiss was not like the first one. That had been a desperate question. This was an answer. It was slow and deep and searching. It tasted of wood smoke and rain, and a desperation so profound it was almost a prayer. It was a kiss that said, "We are alive." He pulled back, his breath ragged, and rested his forehead against hers. "Arden," he whispered, as if the name itself was a discovery. She didn't speak. She just clutched the front of his shirt, feeling the solid, steady thump, thump, thump of his heart under her palm. He kissed her again, his lips moving from her mouth to her cheek, to the sharp line of her jaw. His beard was rough, a grounding, real sensation. His mouth traced a line down the column of her throat, to the hollow at her collarbone. A shiver ran through her, but this time, it had nothing to do with the cold. It was a deep, coiling warmth that started in her stomach and spread, making her breath hitch. She arched her back, her fingers tightening in his shirt. The heat was immediate, overwhelming. It was the feeling of a drought-stricken land, finally feeling the rain. He kissed the skin just above the neckline of the shirt, a slow, warm pressure that made her feel not taken, but found. He tensed. He was trembling. And then, with a strength that astonished her, he pulled back. He pulled back, resting his forehead on hers again. His breathing ragged, he just held her. He tucked her head under his chin, his arms wrapped around her, holding her tightly against his chest. He kissed the top of her head. The passion was still there, a living, breathing thing in the small hove. But he had contained it. He had chosen. The fight was tomorrow. This was the fuel. This was the pause, the breath, the reason. "Tomorrow," he whispered into her hair, his voice thick. "We stand in front of them all. In Rattler. No more running, no more hiding." She burrowed her face into his chest, inhaling the scent of him. "No more hiding," she promised. Dawn came, gray and cold. They were stiff, sore, but alive, and for the first time, not alone. They rode Jubal out of the gully, the sun a weak promise behind the clouds. They stopped on the ridge overlooking Rattler. Below, the town was already stirring. They laid their evidence out on a flat rock. "The ledger," Arden said, tapping the book, "forged, with Vetch's 5-feathered seal." "The pen," Coulter added, holding it up. "Serial number 42, from Vetch's office." "The invoice," Arden said, unfolding the paper, "sent to Elias North." "And the proof," Coulter finished, holding up the hard, perfect wax impression. "The real seal, 7 feathers. It's the whole story." "Almost," Arden said, looking toward the town. "We need Eulalie North, Elias's wife. She runs the brick kiln. The invoice is just paper. Eulalie is the one who received it. She's the one they threatened. Her voice, her testimony. That's what links the paper to the crime." "Then we get her first," Coulter said. They were about to ride down when a small figure came scrambling up the trail. It was a young boy, maybe 10, breathless, his face red from running. "Mr. Rook, Mr. Rook." Coulter dismounted. "Pip North. What is it? Son." The boy, Elias and Eulalie's son, skidded to a halt. He was crying, but he held out a crumpled, folded note. It's from Deputy Pike. He came to the kiln at dawn. He said to give this to you. He said, 'Don't come. Mr. Rook, tell him not to come.'" Coulter's blood went cold. He unfolded the note. The pencil script was Jory's, hurried and rough. "Coulter, Vetch has the territorial warrant. He's not waiting for the hearing. He's going to arrest her on the courthouse steps. On sight, he'll take the ledger. It's a trap. Stay away." Coulter looked at the note. He looked at Arden. All the warmth from the night, all the hope, it just evaporated. "He's going to arrest you," Coulter said, his voice dead. "Before we can even speak, he'll take the pouch, and you'll be in a cell. It's over." Arden stared at him. She saw the defeat in his eyes. She shook her head. The fire was back in her. She swung her leg over Jubal, sliding to the ground. She walked up to Coulter and took the oilskin pouch from his slack hand. "No," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it was iron. "You're wrong. Vetch doesn't want the ledger. He wants me. He wants the ghost. He wants to put the divider in chains." She looked at him, her eyes boring into his. "You're not an outlaw, Coulter Rook. You're a citizen, a landowner, a man who bought a ticket. You're just attending a public hearing." She pushed the pouch into his hands. Let Jory come. Let him put the cuffs on me. You wait until the whole crowd is watching. And then you give the ledger to them. You give the proof to the people." They rode down. The main street of Rattler was packed. Coulter's chalk message had worked. The rumors had worked. They were all there. Miners from the closed shafts, their faces gray with dust and hunger. Ranchers, like him, their shoulders stooped, their eyes angry. The women of the town, in patched calico, holding their children. It was a crowd of the dispossessed. A low, angry murmur hung in the air. On the courthouse steps, a platform had been built. Matilda Crow stood there, a black crow in a black dress, flanked by Harlan Vetch, who looked clean and bored. "This hearing," she was projecting, her voice like ice, "is to restore order to clear the title of this valley, which has been plagued by a ghost, a violent phantom who preys on good, hard-working folk." Coulter and Arden pushed through the crowd. Murmurs followed them. "Is that—" "It's her. It's Rook." They reached the foot of the steps. The crowd went silent. Matilda Crow stopped talking. Her eyes, cold and triumphant, landed on Arden. Deputy Jory Pike stepped forward from the side of the building. His face was pale, his duty a heavy, visible weight. He was holding a pair of iron handcuffs. "Arden Vale," he said, his voice cracking. I have a warrant for your arrest for assault and sedition." He reached for her, before the iron could touch her wrist. Coulter stepped between them. His hand wasn't on his Spencer. He just stood there, a wall of solid, angry muscle. His eyes, cold as the gully stream, locked on Jory's. "Not yet, deputy." Coulter's "not yet, deputy" was not a shout. It was a low, flat statement, but it cut through the murmuring of the crowd like an axe through dry pine. Jory Pike froze, the iron cuffs dangling from his hand. He was a young man, caught between the unyielding iron of the law and the unyielding mass of the people. He looked at Coulter's eyes, and he saw the cinder ridge in them hard, immovable, and cold. This is a warrant. Rook," Jory stammered, trying to find his authority. "It's paper," Coulter said. "This is a public hearing. We're here to attend." From the platform, Harlan Vetch's smooth voice sliced in. "He's right, deputy. Why this unseemly rush? Let the hearing proceed. We must have order. Arrests can certainly wait until after the judge has clarified the legal standing of the Seven Spires Company." He smiled at Matilda Crow. This was what they wanted, to get them inside, off the street, and onto their stage. "Inside," Vetch commanded. "Let us begin." The crowd surged forward, pushing Coulter and Arden through the main doors. The Rattler courthouse was just the town hall, a single large, hot room that smelled of wet wool, old tobacco, and simmering anger. It was packed. Men and women stood along the walls, their faces grim. At the front, on a raised dais, sat Ephraim Cutlass. He was a thin man with a nervous twitch in his cheek, a preacher forced to wear the robes of a territorial judge. He banged a wooden gavel. "Order. This hearing is called to order." His voice was thin, reedy. He was reading from a paper, his hands visibly shaking. "We are gathered to finalize the Land and Water Registry survey for the Flint Water Basin, as submitted by the Seven Spires Company." A man in a clean, black suit, the railroad's lawyer from Rattler, stood up. His name was Grail. "Your Honor," he said, his voice slick, "before we review the new surveys, the company must address the atmosphere of instability and violence that has plagued this valley, an atmosphere created by one person." He pointed directly at Arden. "We have, this morning, come into possession of new evidence regarding the original arson at the Mesa of Ash, a crime this woman was accused of a year ago." He held up a single sheet of paper. "A full confession, Your Honor. Detailing her guilt, we ask that the court recognize it." "Is it signed?" the judge asked, leaning forward. "It is, Your Honor," Grail said, a triumphant smirk on his face. "It's signed with the very same initials she wears as a pendant around her neck, LV." A gasp went through the room. Arden's hand instinctively went to her throat. The locket. Grail turned to the crowd. "A confession, proving her guilt. We demand she be remanded into custody, and her claims dismissed as the ravings of a known criminal." The room was silent. The trap sprung. Arden stepped forward. She was pale, but her voice was clear. "A confession?" "As you heard," Grail said. "Then show me the pen." Grail blinked. I beg your pardon." "The pen," Arden repeated, her voice gaining strength. "The pen that signed that paper. You must have it. Surely the instrument of the confession. Show it to the court." "That is irrelevant," Grail snapped, his composure slipping. "The document is what matters." "It's irrelevant because you can't," Arden said. "It's irrelevant because it's a forgery. It's just ink on paper, like all your other lies." She turned to Coulter. "But we can produce a pen, the pen you use for your real work." Coulter moved. He walked past Grail, up to the judge's dais. He took the heavy, steel-nibbed fountain pen from his pocket and placed it on the desk. The thud was as loud as a gavel. "Pen, serial number 42, Coulter said, his voice a rumble. "Property of Seven Spires Surveying, the one you used to write your invoices." Arden stepped up, placing the water-damaged but legible invoice next to it. "Like this one, an invoice sent to Elias North, charging him $30 for water you already stole. "This is," Grail stammered. "This is stolen property." "Elias North can't be here," Coulter said, ignoring him. "He's detained. By company men, but his wife is—" His voice boomed. "I call Eulalie North." From the back of the room, a small woman in a faded brown dress stood up. She was terrified. She looked at her neighbors, who nodded, pushing her forward. She walked to the front. "Mrs. North," Coulter said, his voice gentle but firm. "Tell Judge Cutlass about the water compensation. Tell him what you signed." Eulalie North twisted her hands together. We didn't sign." "But the ledger," Grail shouted. "The compensation ledger clearly shows your husband's signature." "No!" Eulalie's voice cracked, her fear replaced by a sudden, hot fury. "No, a man from the railroad. He came to our kiln. Our clay was dry. He offered us coal, a half-ton of coal. He said if my Elias would sign the water release." She was weeping now, her voice raw. "My husband, he told him to get off our land, so the Spires man, he laughed. He had an old brick manifest, with my husband's signature from 2 years ago. He copied it. He forged his name, right there in front of me, and said, 'It's signed. The water is ours.'" The room exploded. Shouts of thieves and forgery echoed off the walls. Men stood on the benches, their fists raised. Judge Cutlass hammered his gavel. "Order, order." Before the sound could die, Arden held up her hand. "She's right, forgery is their trade." She pulled the stolen ledger, the Spires compensation book, from the oilskin pouch and held it high. "This is their book, the one they were going to file today. Look at the seal on the cover, the 7 Spires Hawk." She walked along the front row, showing it to the people. "Count the tail feathers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. "So what?" Grail yelled over the noise. "It's a seal!" "It's a fake," Arden shouted back. She reached into the pouch and pulled out the small, hard block of beeswax. This I took from Harlan Vetch's own desk this morning. An impression from his personal seal." She held the wax up to the light of the window. "Count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. She threw the wax onto the judge's desk. It landed next to the pen. "Their own ledger is a forgery. They are using a lie to steal real land." The room was on its feet. The noise was a physical force. "This is a circus." Harlan Vetch was standing now, his voice cutting through the pandemonium like a whip. He was calm. He was smiling, but his eyes were dead. "This woman is a known, violent criminal. She talks of feathers and pens. Let us talk of lead." He turned his cold gaze on Arden. "This woman, on the night of the Salt Depot robbery, shot a company guard, shot him in the back, and left him for dead. She is an arsonist, a thief, and an assailant. Ask the deputy. He was there. Ask Jory Pike." A total, stunned silence fell. Every eye in the room, Coulter's, Crow's, Vetch's. The crowd swung to Deputy Jory Pike, who stood near the door, his hand still on his cuffs. Jory looked like he was going to be sick. He was trapped. He looked at Vetch, who was smiling at him. A look of pure command. He looked at Matilda Crow. He looked at Coulter. Deputy Judge Cutlass prompted, his voice a squeak. "Is this true? Was the guard shot?" Jory swallowed. His gaze dropped to the floorboards. "Yes, Your Honor. He was shot." Vetch's smile widened. "Thank you, Deputy. I believe that. But—" Jory's head snapped up, his face a mask of sweat and tortured conscience. "But it wasn't her." "What did you say, Deputy?" Vetch's voice lost its smoothness. It was foggy," Jory said, the words spilling out of him. Fast. "It was pitch black. We were chasing shadows. One of our own men, one of the new hires from the railroad crew, he panicked. He fired his rifle. He hit Silas. It It was an accident. It was our bullet. She never had a gun. The confession hung in the air. Absolute. Vitek's face was no longer granite. It was a thundercloud. Before he could speak, Matilda Crow rose, her voice like ice. Your Honor, this proceeding has devolved into sheer anarchy. The deputy is clearly confused. The witnesses are being intimidated by this mob. I move to adjourn this hearing until such time as the territorial marshal can be present to ensure order. No, Arden's voice rang out, sharp and clear. You don't want order. You want time. Time to burn the real ledgers. Time to move your fences. She walked to the center of the room, her small, worn figure commanding the space. You want to talk about order, Mrs. Crow. Let's talk about the disorder you've brought to this valley. She pulled the list she and Coulter had made from her pocket. Her voice was not loud, but it was low and clear, and every person strained to hear it. It was a litany, a roll call of the damned. April 12th, the new dam at Serrated Ford. You cut the water to the Thorn Ranch. His cattle died. April 19th, you locked the sluice gate at Miller's Creek. The Smith family. Their corn burned in the fields. May 1st, you dynamited the spring at Cinder Ridge. The Rook Ranch. Sarah Rook. Died of fever. Died of thirst. With every name, a gasp or a sob came from the crowd. It wasn't a mob anymore. It was a congregation of the grieving. May 7th, she continued, her voice cold as the gully stream. The North Kiln, water for coal, forgery. May 10th, the salt. Judge Cutlass was trembling, his face ashen. He looked at Crow, whose face was a mask of cold fury. He looked at the faces of his neighbors, streaked with tears and rage. Outside, the crowd that couldn't fit in the doors had heard the names. They heard the anger. A new sound began, a slow, rhythmic thump, thump, thump on the outside walls. A chant, read the book, read the book, read the book. They weren't asking for the forged ledger. They were asking for the real one, the one Eulalie North had spoken of, the one Vetch had tried to burn. Cutlass raised his hands, his mouth open, about to speak. Crash! The high window on the east wall of the courthouse exploded in a shower of glass. It wasn't a rock. It was the sharp, flat crack of a high-powered rifle. A woman screamed. Sniper! A man roared. Pandemonium. It was the chaos Vetch and Crow had been waiting for. Benches scraped on the floor as people dove for cover. Vetch smiled, a thin, cruel expression. He motioned to his 2 private guards by the door. Get the woman, get the pouch. A second shot tore through the wall, this one lower, kicking up a cloud of plaster just above Jory Pike's head. In the confusion, Coulter acted. He grabbed Arden's arm, not running for the door, but for the judge's dais. This way. He kicked open a low, curtained door behind the judge's chair. A black square opened in the wall. The coal cellar, he yelled, shoving her through. They fell, tumbling down a short, rough-cut flight of stairs, into the cool, absolute darkness below, as the courtroom above them erupted in the sounds of shouting, splintering wood, and a new, terrible, closer gunshot. The cellar was pitch black. They landed on a soft, shifting pile of coal dust, the air thick with sulfur and age. Above them, the courtroom erupted. They heard the crash of an overturned bench, a man's high-pitched scream, and Vetch's voice, not smooth anymore, but a raw, animalistic bark. Find them, get that pouch. This way. Arden gasped. She was not panicking. She was in her element. She grabbed Coulter's sleeve. This is the Old Town Foundation. It connects. He couldn't see a thing, just the faint outline of her shoulder as she moved deeper into the black. He followed, his hand on her back, his other hand holding his Spencer. They stumbled through the dark, the sounds above them a muffled, terrifying thunder. They heard boots on the floorboards, then on the street outside. They're on horses, Coulter whispered, his voice deadened by the earth. "Circling the building?" "The tunnel will let out behind the tannery, in Cat Claw Alley. Go! Go!" She found the opening, a low arch, and they burst out into the gray, misty daylight, gasping for clean air. The alley was a narrow chute between two brick buildings, reeking of lye and cured hides, a rank, chemical stink that gagged him. They heard the clatter of hooves on the main street, moving fast. "They're heading for the South Road," Coulter said, relieved. "They think we fled the county." But then the sound changed. It splintered. Two riders were breaking off, their horses' hooves echoing in the alley, coming their way. "They're checking the alleys," Coulter hissed, pushing Arden back against the brick. "They'll have us pinned." Arden's eyes were sharp, her mind working with a desperate, lucid speed. "We have to split, now." "No, I'm not leaving you." "You have to," she said, grabbing the front of his shirt. "Look, Shale Hill." She pointed to the high, muddy rise on the edge of town. "You're one man, but you're big. You're fast. In this mist, you'll look like two people running. You draw them. Draw the riders. Lead them up the hill." "And you," he said, his hand closing over hers. "What about you?" "I'm not running from them. Coulter, I'm running to them." She pointed toward the sprawling collection of tents and lean-tos across the creek, the place they called the shanty market. The people, the miners, the ones who are starving, the ones who weren't allowed in the courthouse. I'm taking the book to them. He saw the iron in her. This wasn't his fight to lead. This was hers. He still had the oilskin pouch. He thrust it into her hands. "Arden, go draw them now." He gripped her shoulder. A hard, quick squeeze. "Don't you get yourself killed, Vale. Don't you get shot, Rook." He didn't wait. He broke cover, sprinting from the alley, a large, obvious target. He kept low, vaulting a rotten fence, his boots splashing in the mud. The shout went up immediately. "There by the stables, it's them." Two riders, Spire's men in black dusters, saw him. They let out a yell and spurred their horses, charging. Coulter didn't look back. He just ran, his long legs eating up the ground, heading for the slick, muddy path up Shale Hill. He was the perfect decoy. Arden didn't watch him go. She trusted him. She pulled her shawl over her head, clutching the precious pouch to her chest, and slipped back into the shadows, moving toward the center of town. She knew these back alleys. She had lived in them. She moved through yards, over fences, keeping to the muddy banks of the creek. She came up on the edge of the shanty market. It was a place of quiet, desperate misery. Dozens of families, thrown off their land by Vetch's water games, living in shelters made of old canvas, packing crates, and potato sacks. Children with thin, pale faces and eyes that were far too old stared at her as she passed. The noise from the courthouse, the gunshots, the shouting had reached them. Men and women were standing outside their hovels, confused, scared, and angry, not knowing which way to run. Arden saw her platform. It was a heavy freight wagon, its wheels sunk to the hubs in mud, its bed empty. She didn't hesitate. She scrambled up the heavy wheel, grabbing the side rail, and hauled herself onto the wagon bed. She stood there, a small, defiant figure, her hair a wild, tangled mess, her clothes stained with coal dust, river water, and mud. She held the oilskin pouch high over her head. "People?" Her voice was raw from the cellar, but it cut through the murmuring. "People of Flintwater, they told you I was a ghost. They told you I was a thief." Heads turned. They recognized her. It was the divider. It was the woman from the posters. "They lied," she cried. "They lied about the arson at Crow's farm. They lied about the salt depot. And today, in that courthouse, they are lying about your water." She ripped the ledger from the pouch. "Harlan Vetch and Matilda Crow are in that building right now, presenting a forged book to a bought judge. They are stealing this valley, but I have their book, the one they stole, the one that lists your names." A man in the front, his face gray with mine dust, his ribs showing through his torn shirt, spat on the ground. "It's just talk, girl, we've heard talk." "Talk," Arden's voice cracked with a year's worth of fury. "Is this talk?" She opened the book, the pages damp and curling. "Elias North, did you sign away your water rights for a bag of coal?" From the edge of the crowd, Eulalie North, who had fled the courthouse in the chaos, let out a wail. "No, he wouldn't. They forged his name. I saw them." "Jebediah Smith," Arden shouted, her finger finding the name. "Did you sign away Miller's Creek on May 19th? A tall, gaunt man with a ragged beard stepped forward, his eyes wide. "May 19th, I was in Rattler. I was hauling freight for the smithy. I wasn't even in the basin that day." A roar went up. It was one thing to hear a rumor. It was another to see the ink, to hear the names. "And the Thorn Ranch," Arden cried, her voice breaking with the injustice of it. "April 12th. They cut the water. They said it was legal, but here is the entry forged. They murdered his cattle." "They murdered my son!" a woman shrieked from the crowd. She held up a single, tiny, worn-out leather boot. "He died of the fever. We had no water to cool him, no medicine. They murdered him." The crowd was no longer a collection of victims. It was a single, breathing, wounded animal. It was an ocean of rage, and Arden had just given it a voice. "She's right." The voice was clear, strong, and full of shame. Jory Pike pushed his way through the crowd. He wasn't wearing his slicker. He wasn't wearing his hat. He walked to the front, and he held up his silver deputy's badge for all to see. "She is telling the truth," he said, his voice shaking. I was there. I was part of it." He looked at the faces of his neighbors, the miners, the women. "I heard the orders. From Vetch himself. He told us to suppress the valley. He said, shoot to clear. He didn't want arrests. He wanted graves." The confession landed like a physical blow. The crowd, which had been loud, went deathly silent. Jory Pike looked at the silver star in his hand. He looked at the woman holding the tiny boot. He looked at the ground. And then, with a final, choked sob, he threw the badge into the mud. I'm not a deputy for murderers," he said, his voice thick. I'm a citizen of this valley, like you. Seize that woman." The voice was like a whip crack. Matilda Crow. She had ridden her black mare right into the square, her face a mask of cold venom. Harlan Vetch was beside her, his face granite, flanked by 3 of his hired guards. The sniper was gone, his work of chaos done. "She is inciting a riot," Crow screamed, pointing at Arden. "Jory Pike, you are derelict in your duty. Arrest her." Jory stood, his hand near his empty holster. "I arrest no one, Mrs. Crow. Not on your order." "Then you will," she snarled at her guards. The 3 men raised their rifles, their expressions cold, and began to push into the crowd. But the crowd did not move back. A new line had formed. The mothers, the women who had lost their children, their farms, their husbands. Eulalie North, the woman with the boot. They stepped forward. They were armed, not with guns. They were holding buckets. They were holding heavy, iron laundry tubs. They were holding sections of stove wood. One woman, tall and thin, held a long, wooden flail, the kind used for beating wheat. They formed a wall, a silent, unmovable wall of patched calico, grim faces and pure, maternal fury. "This," Eulalie North said, her voice quiet, "is a water rebellion, Mrs. Crow, and you are not welcome here." Crow's face was a study in disbelief and rage. You dare—" "Get out of their way," Vetch snarled. He had lost his patience. This was all slipping away. He motioned to his men. "Fire a shot over their heads. Scatter these—" "Hey!" The roar came from the main street. It was Coulter. He was not on a horse. He was on the high-painted seat of the Rattlertown water wagon, a massive 1,000-gallon cypress barrel on wheels, pulled by two huge draft horses. It was the town's only fire protection. He must have doubled back from Shale Hill, run to the livery, and seen it. He cracked the reins, and the heavy wagon rumbled into the square, the crowd parting before it like the Red Sea. He pulled the massive horses to a halt, the wagon blocking the street, right in front of Vetch's horse. "You want the water, Vetch!" Coulter roared, his face a mask of sweat, mud, and pure fury. "You love it so much, then have it." He stood up on the high seat, reached back, and wrenched the large iron lever on the side of the tank. The valve opened. 1,000 gallons of cold, clean, town water exploded from the back of the wagon. It hit the dry, packed earth of the square with a sound like a roar. It was not a stream. It was a flash flood. It washed over the feet of the crowd, turning the dust into a river of thick, brown mud. It swirled around the hooves of Crow's horse, making the animal panic. It was the water they had been denied. It was the water their children had died for. It was a baptism. It was a revolution. A woman cheered. A man shouted. The crowd surged. Not in anger, but in a wild, sudden joy. They were ankle-deep in their water. Judge Ephraim Cutlass, who had fled the courthouse, was swept up in the surge, his black robe soaked, his face a mask of pure terror. He was surrounded by Jory Pike, by Eulalie North, by the miners. "Tss, Judge," Jory yelled, grabbing his arm. "You see this? You see the people make it right. Make it right now." Cutlass, his authority gone, his terror complete, held up his shaking hands. I, by the authority invested in me by this territory, I declare a freeze. A freeze. All 7 spires contracts are suspended, pending a full investigation by the marshal's office. It was over. Vetch had lost. His face, for the first time, was not calm. It was a twisted, ugly mask of pure, reptilian rage. He had lost the land. He had lost the law. He had lost control. With a snarl, he ripped his pistol from his holster, a small, elegant, pearl-handled revolver. He leveled it, not at the crowd, not at Coulter. He leveled it at Arden, still standing on the wagon. "You," he hissed. Coulter was off the water wagon in a single leap. He landed in the mud between them, his arms spread wide, his Spencer still slung on his back. He was a human shield. "Enough!" he roared. The word was a physical blow. The square went silent. Vetch's hand trembled. The gun aimed directly at Coulter's chest. Crack! The gunshot was sharp, but it wasn't Vetch's. It was Jory Pike's. He had grabbed a pistol from a miner's belt. He was not a marksman. He was not aiming to harm. He was aiming for the gun. The bullet struck the silver trigger guard of Vetch's revolver. The impact was a metallic scream. The gun was ripped from Vetch's grasp, spinning end over end, landing uselessly in the new, deep mud. Vetch stared at his stinging, empty hand. He stared at Jory. He looked at the crowd, a solid wall of angry, wet faces. He was unarmed. He was beaten. Matilda Crow saw it. She saw the game was lost, for today. She pulled her mare's head around, her face a controlled, terrifying mask of hatred. She looked at the ruined square. She looked at Arden, clutching the ledger. Then her gaze slid to Coulter. "You," she said, her voice low and cold, but it carried over the dripping water. "You, Rook, you've made a terrible, terrible mistake. You've protected this phantom." She smiled, a terrible, thin-lipped expression. "Enjoy your water, enjoy your land. For tonight." She leaned forward in her saddle. "Tonight, Cinder Ridge will burn. Your precious ranch, it will be ash." She dug her heels into the mare's flanks. She, Vetch, and their remaining guards galloped away, splashing through the mud, leaving the threat hanging in the wet, liberated air. The crowd began to cheer, to celebrate, to splash in the water. But Arden didn't hear them. She was still on the wagon bed, clutching the ledger. She looked at Coulter, who was standing in the mud, his chest still heaving, his eyes fixed on the road where Crow had disappeared. The fight for the valley was won. Now, the fight for their home was about to begin. She looked at him, her expression hardening. It was time to go home. The cheer and Rattler died the moment they cleared the town line. The ride back to Cinder Ridge was not a victory lap. It was a race against a dying sun. Crow's threat was not idle, and they all knew it. They were not alone. Jory Pike, his face set in a grim mask of newfound purpose, rode with them. Eulalie North, her son Pip riding behind her, and a dozen other men and women from the shanty market miners and ranchers who had lost everything followed. They were a small, ragged army, armed with shovels, axes, and a terrible unified resolve. When they reached the ranch, Coulter didn't pause. "Jebediah," he yelled to the old ditch master. "The old irrigation canal. I need it diverted. I want the yard. I want the entire yard around this house to be a foot deep in mud." The men grabbed shovels and ran. Eulalie, Arden took charge of the others, her voice clear and sharp. "The hay. Get it away from the barn. Stack it against the fences. Douse it. Use the trough. The well, everything must be wet." A frantic energy seized them. Men dug with desperate speed, diverting the small, precious trickle from the spring. Women formed a bucket brigade, soaking the very foundation of the house, the barn walls, the porch steps. Jory Pike, using his skill with ropes, climbed to the roof, stringing up old cowbells and scrap metal on tripwires across the perimeter. Lanterns were hung at the four corners, casting a sickly yellow light against the falling dusk. Arden was organizing the water pails on the porch when she saw Pip, Eulalie's 10-year-old son, trying to haul a bucket of water. He was struggling, but his face was set with adult determination. Arden knelt, stopping him. "Pip," her voice was gentle, but it was absolute. "I can help. Ma'am, I know you can." She looked up at Eulalie. "Take him. Take all the children. And the old folks. Get the wagons. Head up to the high ridge. And don't come down. Not until you see the sun." "Arden, we need every hand," Eulalie protested. "No." Arden's gaze was iron. "We fought for them. We fought for their future. We will not spend it in one night. Get them clear. That is not a request. That is the only way we win." She looked at Pip. "You protect your mother. You hear from the ridge. That's your post." Eulalie nodded, her eyes filling with tears. She gathered the other children and the two oldest men and herded them toward the wagons. As they left, Coulter walked up to Arden. The yard was already a shallow lake of mud, reflecting the lantern light. He was carrying his Spencer, and another just like it. He held the second rifle out to her. It was identical to his, the stock worn smooth, the bluing faded. This was Sarah's," he said, his voice low. "She was a better shot than I was. She kept the coyotes off the lambs." Arden stared at the gun. She had never fired a weapon at a person. She had carried a knife. But this was different. "Coulter, It's not a legacy to kill," he said, pressing it into her hands. "It's a legacy. It's to keep the house. And this is our house." She gripped the cold steel. It was heavy, heavy with the weight of the woman who had died, and the man who was standing here, willing to. She checked the load. It was ready. Darkness fell. It was complete. The faint breeze died, and the basin held its breath. The only sound was the drip, drip, drip of water from the soaked roof. A single, tinny clang cut the night, a bell on Jory's tripwire. Arden shouldered the rifle, her heart hammering against her ribs. They came, not as a charge, but as a silent, spreading line of shadows moving just beyond the ring of lantern light. 10, maybe 12 riders, and one, sitting motionless on a tall black mare. Matilda Crow. "They've got oil," Jory whispered from the barn roof. "I can smell it." Crow's voice was clear in the blackness, calm and cold. "The house first. I want it to light up the sky, burn the nest, and the rats will run." A man on foot ran forward, a torch high. He was 20 yards from the porch. Arden did not hesitate. She lined up the sights, not on the man, but on the woman. She took a breath, held it, and squeezed the trigger. The crack of the Spencer was sharp, definitive. The torchbearer dove to the ground. Out on the ridge. Matilda Crow did not flinch, but the black silk scarf at her throat was suddenly gone, ripped away by the bullet, fluttering like a wounded bird into the mud. A warning. "Now!" a man shouted, and the attack began. Torches arced through the air. The first one hit a wet hay bale by the fence. It landed with a loud wet tss and died, throwing up a cloud of steam. "It's not working!" a raider yelled. "The roof!" another shouted. A new volley. One torch, soaked in oil, hit the dry shingles of the porch overhang. Whoosh! The flames were immediate, yellow and hungry, catching on the dry wood. "Water!" Eulalie screamed, and the defense began. It was not a gunfight. It was a battle of elements. Crow had brought fire. Coulter had brought the water they had won. Eulalie and the other women grabbed the pails, forming a chain from the flooded ditch, throwing cascades of muddy water onto the porch, dousing the flames. They were beating the fire with the very thing Crow had stolen. A shot rang out. High and to the left, a zing as a bullet ricocheted off the water trough. "Sniper!" Jory yelled from the barn. "He's on the silo!" Another shot. This one was aimed. It shattered the lantern above Arden's head, plunging the porch into darkness. "Coulter!" Arden screamed, dropping to one knee, her eyes searching the dark. But Coulter wasn't there. He was on his horse, a dark shape moving fast along the ridge line, behind the attackers. He had flanked them. He saw the main threat, 2 men on mules, loaded not with torches, but with heavy 10-gallon kegs of oil. They were moving toward the barn. Coulter spurred his horse, charging out of the darkness. He didn't fire his rifle. He rode like a man possessed, a dark avenger, and slammed his horse directly into the lead mule. The animal screamed. The raider was thrown, crashing into the mud. Coulter vaulted from his own saddle, knife in hand, and cut the harness on the second mule, slapping its rump. The animal, free of its load, bolted, taking the rest of the oil with it. On the silo, the sniper was reloading, confident. He heard a noise below, a scrape on the ladder. He looked down. Jory Pike was climbing, his face set. The sniper raised his rifle, but Jory was too close. The sniper tried to swing the barrel down as Jory hauled himself onto the platform. He didn't have a gun. He had his lariat. Before the sniper could fire, Jory threw. The loop was fast, perfect. It didn't catch the man. It caught the rifle. Jory yanked, pulling the weapon from the sniper's hands. It clattered to the ground, 50 feet below. The sniper was disarmed, trapped, and beaten. On the ground, the main fire was out, the porch a smoking, sodden mess. The raiders, their oil gone and their sniper silent, were disorganized. Arden moved along the fence line, reloading the Spencer, checking for any new flames. A shape stepped out of the smoke from the barn. It was Harlan Vetch. His fine black duster was torn, his face smeared with soot. His eyes were no longer cold. They were boiling with a terrible, ruined rage. He had lost the railroad, lost the water, lost his pride. He had nothing left but this. He had a pistol in his hand, the same pearl-handled revolver. "You!" he hissed and lunged, grabbing her. He slammed her back against the fence, the wooden rail digging into her spine. He pressed the gun to her head. "You ruined everything." Arden's breath was gone, punched from her lungs. She could smell the oil and the rage on him. She heard the click as he cocked the hammer. Her eyes darted, desperate, searching. She saw Coulter, 50 yards away, near the barn, fighting two of the raiders, his back to her. He couldn't see. Crack! A bullwhip. The sound was as loud as a gunshot. It struck the mud at Arden's feet. Matilda Crow rode up, her face a pale mask in the gloom. The warning shot hadn't scared her. It had angered her. "On your knees, girl," Crow commanded, her voice low and terrible. "You will kneel to me before he scatters your brains." Vetch jammed the barrel harder into Arden's temple. "Do it." Arden was shaking, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She looked at Vetch's dead eyes. She looked at Crow's triumphant sneer. She thought of the children on the hill. She thought of Sarah Rook. Her shaking stopped. She stood straight, pushing her back against the fence, her chin high. "I don't kneel," she said, her voice a raw whisper, but it was full of iron. "I will not kneel to the woman who steals the future from children." "Insolent!" Crow hissed, raising the whip. "Then die on your feet!" Vetch snarled, his finger tightening on the trigger. Arden. Coulter's roar. He had seen. He was running, a desperate, full-out sprint from the barn, dropping his rifle, knowing he was too far. Vetch spun, his arm extending, swinging the gun from Arden's head toward the running man. Bang! The shot exploded in the night. Coulter didn't stop. He hit Vetch like a locomotive, a full-body tackle that sent both men crashing into the flooded, muddy ditch. Arden screamed. Coulter, he'd been hit. She saw the dark stain blossom on his left shoulder, high, near the collar. The impact of the tackle had thrown Vetch off balance. His grip on the pistol, slick with mud and water, was broken. Arden reacted. She didn't hesitate. She didn't faint. She raised Sarah's Spencer, not to fire, but as a club. She brought the heavy wooden stock down in a short, vicious arc. Crack! It connected with Vetch's wrist. A bone snapped. The revolver flew from his numb fingers, landing in the deep mud. Arden dropped the rifle and threw herself on top of him, grabbing his head, shoving his face down into the cold, muddy water of the ditch he had tried to keep dry. "You will stop." It was over. The remaining raiders saw Vetch down, the sniper gone, the oil lost. They saw the faces of the ranchers and miners Jebediah, Eulalie, and the others emerging from the smoke. They were holding pitchforks. They were holding axes. They were not afraid. The raiders fled. Matilda Crow sat on her mare, surrounded. The villagers formed a silent, cold ring around her. She looked at their faces, hard as granite, streaked with soot. She had no authority here. Her fire was dead. With a snarl of pure, undiluted hatred, she yanked her horse's head around, dug her heels in, and galloped into the night, defeated. Jory Pike, his lariat in hand, walked to the ditch where Arden was still holding Vetch's head. "That's enough. Arden, he's done." He hauled the sputtering, broken man out of the mud. He pulled Vetch's hands behind his back, from his pocket. Jory pulled not the old cuffs, but his new badge, the one the town had given him. He used its sharp pin to bind Vetch's hands together. "Harlan Vetch, you're under arrest." A profound, exhausted silence fell, broken only by the sound of dripping water and Vetch's choking coughs. Then, a new sound, a low, distant rumble, thunder. A single fat drop of rain hit Arden's cheek, then another and another. The sky, which had only threatened, finally broke. The real rain, the first rain of the season, began to fall. It was a deluge, a blessing, a cleansing. The lanterns, still lit, cast a shimmering light on the soaking, safe, saved ranch. Arden let out a single, sharp laugh of relief. She turned, her face upturned to the clean, wonderful rain. "Coulter, Coulter, it's raining." He wasn't beside her. She saw him. He was at the porch, the same porch where she had collapsed. A lifetime ago. He was leaning against the railing, his hand clamped to his bleeding shoulder. He looked at her. He tried to smile. He took one step toward her. His knee buckled. Arden watched, the rain suddenly cold, as he sank to the wooden boards, slumping against the post, his eyes closing, his face pale as death in the new, clean light. The rain was a celebration, a roar of approval from the sky. But Arden didn't hear it. Her world had narrowed to the single, awful sight of Coulter, slumping to the porch. She ran. The mud, once her enemy, was now a cleansing balm. But she didn't care. She slid the last few feet on her knees, coming to a stop on the rough-hewn boards, the very same spot where she had collapsed, what felt like 100 years ago. He was chalk white, his eyes closed. The rain was already washing the blood from his shoulder, but the dark stain was spreading too fast. He was cold. "Coulter!" She grabbed his face, her hands, still shaking from the fight, cupping his jaw. His skin was clammy. "Coulter, open your eyes. Look at me." His eyelids fluttered, a paper-thin movement. He was trying to breathe, but his breath was shallow. A sharp, hitching gasp. The shock, the blood loss. He was fading. "No," she whispered, her voice a raw, desperate command. "No, you don't. You don't get to leave. Not now." She remembered. That first night, the panic, his hand. "It's my turn, Rook," she said, her voice breaking. She took her own hand, the one stained with soot and his blood, and pressed it flat against his chest, right over his heart. She felt the frantic, shallow, failing beat. "You're safe," she whispered, leaning in, her forehead pressing against his temple, the cold rain plastering her hair to his face. "You're safe now. Just breathe with my hand. Breathe with me." He was too far gone to hear her. His breathing hitched again. She kissed his cheek, a desperate, warm pressure against his cold skin. "Stay with me. Coulter, stay." "He's bleeding out." The voice was Jory Pike's, sharp and suddenly clear. He was at her side, his face pale. "We have to get him inside. We have to stop it." A new sound, the rumble of the crowd. They hadn't stayed in Rattler to celebrate. They had followed. Eulalie, Jebediah, the miners, the ranchers. They surged into the yard. "Get him in the house!" Jebediah roared. Hands, dozens of them, reached for him. They lifted Coulter, a human wave, carrying him with a gentleness that belied their rough calluses. They carried him into the cabin he had defended, laying him on the thick bearskin rug in front of the hearth, the very spot where she had bled and sewn her own wound. But the night and the fight had taken their toll. The rain was pouring through the shattered front window. A section of the roof, charred and broken by crow's torches, was letting in a cold, steady stream. "He'll die of the cold," Eulalie cried, her hand on Coulter's forehead. We can't keep him dry." Jory Pike looked at the broken roof. He looked at the men standing around. Helpless, he looked at their coats. "Coats," he ordered, his voice the new law in the valley. "Give me your coats." In a single, unified, unspoken movement, the men miners in thin canvas, ranchers in worn wool stripped off their coats. They didn't hand them inside. They went back out. They climbed onto the porch. They stood on the railings. They held their coats, their slickers, their jackets, over the broken roof, stretching them taut. They formed a living, breathing shelter. They stood in the pouring, cold rain, their bodies a shield, protecting the man who had given them back the water. Inside, the cabin became a field hospital. "Jory," Arden said, her voice steady. "The bullet." Jory looked at the wound. It was high on the shoulder, a messy, dark tear. I think it went through." "Check," she ordered. She was no longer the outlaw. She was the commander. Eulalie was already at the hearth, boiling water, her hands moving with a practiced, maternal speed. She was shredding clean linen. "The willow bark," she said. "Pip, run to the creek. Get the new willow bark. The tea, it'll stop the fever." The community. The one thing Matilda Crow could never buy, build, or understand, was knitting itself together. It was holding the line. It was keeping its hero alive. Dawn came, clear, sharp, and smelling of wet pine. The rain had stopped, and the basin felt washed clean. From the town of Rattler, a sound carried on the new air. The church bell. Clang, clang, clang. It wasn't the sound of an alarm. It was the sound of a summons. Arden, who had not left Coulter's side, looked up. He was breathing, deeply. His fever had not taken. The willow bark tea, and the sheer, collective will of the valley, had held him. Jebediah Smith rode in an hour later, his old mule looking spry, his face split by a grin that was missing 2 teeth. You ain't gonna believe it," he said, standing in the doorway. "It's done." He told them the townspeople, led by Eulalie and Jory, had not slept. At the first light, they had gathered on the courthouse steps, a silent, unmovable wall. They had brought the ledger. They had brought the pen. They had brought the wax seal. Judge Ephraim Cutlass, his face ashen, had emerged, expecting a riot. He found order. He saw the crowd. He saw the evidence, laid out on the step by Jory Pike. He saw the faces of every citizen in his territory. He saw the truth. And, as Jebediah told it, the preacher had found his spine, with a trembling voice, but one that gained strength with every word. Cutlass had made the proclamation from the steps, by the authority of this territory, and in the face of overwhelming evidence, this court hereby declares all water contracts, leases and transfers to the Seven Spires Company null and void. A roar had gone up. Jebediah said that shook the windows. He issued the warrants. Jebediah was beaming now. For Harlan Vetch, who Jory had trussed up in the town jail, and for Matilda Crow, conspiracy to defraud the public trust, conspiracy to commit murder. Arden looked at Coulter. He was sleeping, his face peaceful. She stood up. She walked to the wash basin and scrubbed the soot and dried blood from her face and hands. She put on Sarah's rifle, a weight that now felt familiar, like a part of her. She went to the barn and saddled Jubal. She rode to Rattler. The town was celebrating. The water wagon was still in the square, now a symbol of their victory. The crowd parted for her, their expressions a mix of awe, gratitude, and respect. They cheered as she passed. She dismounted and walked up the courthouse steps, past the shattered glass. She found Judge Cutlass in his office. He was sitting at his desk, his head in his hands. She didn't speak. She walked to the desk. She laid the oilskin pouch on the polished wood. She laid the pen beside it. She laid the wax impression, with its 7 perfect feathers, on top. "This," she said, her voice quiet, "is for the territorial marshal. It's the proof." Cutlass looked at the evidence. He looked at her. They'll hang me in Cheyenne for this." "They will carry you on their shoulders in Rattler for it," Arden said. She turned to leave. "Miss Vale," the judge called, his voice small. She stopped. "The matter of your own warrant, for the arson, for sedition, it is still active." Arden turned. She looked at the small, frightened, brave man. "I know." She walked out onto the courthouse porch. She faced the crowd. They went silent. "They tell you I am an outlaw," she called out, her voice clear and strong. "They say I am an arsonist. They say I attacked a wagon and robbed a depot, and they are telling the truth." A stunned murmur went through the crowd. "I am guilty of those things," she said, her voice shaking, but she held her ground. She thought of Coulter, of his clean fight. "But I did them because the law, your law, had failed. I did them to protect what was yours, to protect your children." She took a deep breath. "I am not asking for a pardon. I am asking for accomplice clemency. I ask that my actions, my crimes be judged not as acts against property, but as acts to protect the people. Eulalie North's voice was the first. She speaks for U.S. Jory Pike, his new badge pinned to his shirt, stepped forward. She saved this valley. She saved me from a liar's badge. A roar went up. It was not a plea. It was a demand. Clemency. She is one of us. She is Flintwater. Judge Cutlass stepped out onto the porch, holding the old, tattered wanted poster for Arden Vale. He looked at the crowd. He looked at Arden. He tore the poster in half, and then in half again. By the will of the people, he said, his voice ringing with a newfound strength. This court finds no crime. This court finds a citizen. The fall was fast, with the evidence, the testimony of the entire valley, and Judge Cutlass's report. The territorial marshal had no choice. Harlan Vetch, his wrist in a splint, was taken by federal marshals, bound for trial in Cheyenne. He never returned. Matilda Crow was a ghost. She had vanished in the night, her grand house at Mesa of Ash empty, her assets seized by the territory. The first act of the new Flint Water Basin Committee was to seize her water rights. The dams were dynamited. The creek at Cinder Ridge, for the first time in 2 long, dry years, began to flow. Arden returned to the ranch 3 days later. The air smelled of wet earth, of pine, and of life. She found him on the porch. He was sitting in his rocker, his arm in a clean sling, the wool quilt over his knees. He wasn't looking at the road. He was watching the small, muddy, beautiful trickle of water that was now his creek. She sat on the top step, just at his feet, and leaned her head against his good knee. They sat in silence for a long, long time. The only sound was the gurgle of the new water. The song of a valley returned. It's over, she whispered. No, he said, his voice rough. It's just beginning. She looked up at him. This ranch, he said, his gaze fixed on the water. It's always felt empty. Since Sarah, it needs tending. The land it's thirsty. He finally turned, his eyes meeting hers. The old, deep grief she had always seen there, the haunted look, was gone. It was replaced by a quiet, steady warmth. This house, if you want it, this water, he paused, then said, Stay and help me rename the creek. Sarah, she always hated the name Cinder Ridge. Arden felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with a fever. What did she want to call it? Willow Creek, he whispered, a small smile touching his lips. She always wanted to plant willows. That night, the house was warm. The community had mended the roof. A new pane of glass was in the window. The smell of Eulalie's rabbit stew filled the small kitchen. Arden was at the wash basin, the simple, domestic act of washing a pot feeling like a miracle. She heard him walk up behind her. He didn't touch her. He just stood there. A presence. She turned, drying her hands on a rag. The battle was over. The race was run. There was nothing left to fight. He stepped forward, his good arm coming around her, pulling her close. His other arm, in its sling, rested at his side. Arden wrapped her arms around his waist, pressing her face into the clean linen of his shirt. She breathed him in. Wood smoke, coffee, soap, and just Coulter. He held her. He just held her. It wasn't the desperate cold clinging in the shepherd's hovel. This was solid. This was an arrival. He kissed her. It was slow. It was gentle. It was a promise. Not of passion, but of presence. His lips were soft, warm. He pulled back, just enough to press his forehead to hers. You're shaking, he whispered. I'm not cold, she whispered back. He kissed her again, a long, slow, warm kiss that felt like the end of a drought. It was a kiss that didn't demand anything. It just gave. It was the safest she had ever felt in her entire life. A week later, the valley was turning green. The new grass woken by the water, was pushing up. Coulter was strong enough to work. He was at the front gate, by the road. He had torn down the old, charred Rook Ranch sign. He was nailing up a new, clean pine board. Arden came out, carrying a small pot of black paint and a brush. He had carved the words. She painted them in. The sign was simple. It didn't have a name. It just said, "Not for sale, water belongs to the living." And in smaller letters, at the bottom, she carefully painted the new words. Flint Water Basin Committee. Spring came to the valley. It bloomed, a riot of yellow mustard and blue lupine. The children, Pip and the others, were back, their faces full and rosy, their laughter echoing from the hills. They were chasing butterflies through the fields. By the creek, which now flowed clear and strong, shaded by a dozen new thin willow saplings, Coulter was working the handle of the new iron pump. His arm was strong, the wound a clean, white scar. Arden was holding a watering can, waiting for it to fill. He stopped pumping. The water splashed. He just looked at her. She was wearing a simple calico dress, her hair tied back, her face tan, her hands stained with good, dark earth. She looked back at him, a small, easy smile touching her lips. They didn't have to promise forever. They didn't have to promise a perfect, easy life. They just had to promise today, and they promised it every day, with every bucket of water, with every shared look. They promised to choose each other, to be present, to tend the land. On the porch where an outlaw had once collapsed, broken and hunted, two people now stood, shoulder to shoulder, watching the sun set on their valley. Peace had been invited in, and this time, it had decided to stay. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment below so we can all connect and share our thoughts. Please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1,850 inches, and give this video a like. And if you're able to, please support us by hitting that hype button, so this story can be heard by even more people.